The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, thomsbeets.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Thom, Thom. Today we're reading from Martha Nussbaum's new book, The Monarchy of Fear, a philosopher looks at our political crisis. This is from the introduction. There's a lot of fear around in the U.S. today, and this fear is often mingled with anger, blame, and envy. Fear all too often blocks rational deliberation, poisons hope, and impedes constructive cooperation for a better future. What is today's fear about? Well, many Americans feel themselves powerless, out of control of their own lives. They fear that the American dream, the hope that our children will flourish and do even better than you have done, has died, and that everything has slipped away from them. These feelings have their basis in real problems, among others, income stagnation in the lower middle class, alarming declines in the health and longevity of members of this group, especially men, and the escalating costs of higher education at the very time that a college degree is increasingly required for employment. But real problems are difficult to solve, and their solutions take long, hard study and cooperative work toward an uncertain future. It can consequently seem all too attractive to convert that sense of panic and impotence into blame and the othering of outsider groups such as immigrants, racial minorities, and women. They have taken our jobs, or wealthy elites have stolen our country. The problems that globalization and automation create for working-class Americans are real, deep, and seemingly intractable. Rather than face those difficulties and uncertainties, people who sense their standard of living declining can instead grasp after villains, and a fantasy takes shape. If we can somehow keep them out, build a wall, or keep them in their place in subservient positions, we can regain our pride and, for men, their masculinity. Fear leads then to aggressive othering strategies rather than to useful analysis. At the same time, fear also runs rampant among men on people on the left who seek greater social and economic equality and the vigorous protection of hard-won rights for women and minorities. Many people who are dismayed by the election are reacting to it as if the end of the world is at hand. A majority of my students, many acquaintances, many colleagues feel and say often with anguish that our democracy is on the verge of collapse, that the new administration is unprecedented in its willingness to cater to racism, misogyny, and homophobia. They fear especially for the possible collapse of democratic freedoms, speech, travel, association, the press. My younger students especially think that the America they know and love is about to disappear. Rather than analyze matters soberly and listen to other people trying to sort things through, they often demonize an entire half of the American electorate, portraying them as monsters, enemies of everything good. As in the book of Revelation, these are the last days when a righteous remnant must contend against satanic forces. We all need first to take a deep breath and recall our history. When I was a little girl, African Americans were being lynched in the South. Communists were losing their jobs. Women were just barely beginning to enter prestigious universities in the workforce, and sexual harassment was a ubiquitous offense that had no laws to deter it. Jews could not win partnerships in major law firms. Gays and lesbians, criminals under law, were almost always in the closet. People with disabilities had no rights in public space and public education. Transgender was a category that had as yet no name. America was far from beautiful. These facts tell us two things my students need to know. First, the America for which they are nostalgic never existed, not fully. It was a work in progress, a set of dynamic aspirations put in motion by tough work, cooperation, hope, and solidarity over a long period of time. A just and inclusive America never was, and is not yet a fully achieved reality. Second, this present moment may look like backsliding from our march toward human equality, but it's not the apocalypse, and it's actually a time when hope and work can accomplish a great deal of good. On both left and right, panic doesn't just exaggerate our dangers, it also makes our moment much more dangerous than it would otherwise be, more likely to lead to genuine disasters. It's like a bad marriage in which fear, suspicion, and blame displace careful thought about what the real problems are and how to resolve them. Instead, those emotions taking over become their own problem and prevent constructive work, hope, listening, and cooperation. When people are afraid of one another and of an unknown future, fear easily gives rise to scapegoating, to fantasies of payback, and to a poisonous envy of the fortunate, whether those victorious in the election or those dominant socially and economically. We all remember FDR's statement that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. We recently heard departing President Obama say, democracy can buckle when we give in to fear.
1 minute.
Roosevelt was wrong if we take his words literally. Although we had reason to fear fear, we certainly had many other things to fear in his time, such as Nazism, hunger, and social conflict. Fear of those evils was rational, and to that extent, we should not fear our fear, though we should always examine it. But Obama's more precise and modest statement is surely right. Giving way to fear, which means drifting with its currents, refusing skeptical examination, is surely dangerous. We need to think hard about fear and where fear is leading us. After taking a deep breath, we all need to understand ourselves as well as we can, using that moment of detachment to figure out where fear and related emotions come from and where they are leading us. But you might not be concerned so far that fear is really a deep problem for democratic self-government. And then she goes into a dialogue about that. The Monarchy of Fear by Martha Nussbaum.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. Yesterday, at the very end of the show, I had a caller who basically, an African-American caller, who was basically asking, you know, what have the Democrats done for me? And I said, well, there's civil rights. But the thing that tripped me on this, or tripped this button, triggered a button in my head, was the fact that I know that this is a Republican trolling line, and in fact that has been promoted by Donald Trump explicitly in his speeches, and that I believe was even part of the Marina Butina indictment. And so I was, shall we say, a little pissed off, I guess is the right phrase, that this guy, you know, kind of caught me and was 50 seconds to go at the end of the show. And I think my response to him came off as dismissive or even condescending, and you know, well, maybe it was intended that way. Anyhow, I wanted to reality check all this with our old friend Joe Madison, whose show is on Sirius XM every day from 6 to 10 a.m. on Sirius Channel 126. He's a civil and human rights activist. JoeMadison.com is his website. His Twitter handle is MadisonSiriusXM. Joe, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So your thoughts and how you would respond to somebody asking that question.
Well, I got the same question, and it might have been from the same folk, and they always, first of all, let's understand something. Nobody admits to being a troll. So let's recognize even when they're caught. So that's the first thing. But I got the same question not too long ago, and I got that a matter of fact quite a bit during the last presidential campaign, and it was also an attempt to try to discourage African Americans from either one, voting for Hillary, 2, going to the polls, and then 3, saying voting does no good. And they usually start off with, okay, what has this party done for you? Well, I got the question the other day. Now, here's how I responded to it. I said, let's take just 5 general categories. 1, criminal justice. Look at the Democratic position on criminal justice. It's very clear. I won't go through the ABCDs of it. 2, environment. environmental justice, particularly as it relates to lead in public school waters. I think 90% of the public schools, they're not even providing funding, get this, not even providing funding to test the waters to make sure that it's safe and what has to be done to get the lead out of the water. 2, public education. Number 3, the health care. But let me just give this person who called in a couple of things that Democrats have done, and they're not perfect by any means. Just during President Obama's administration, you had 62 lifetime appointments of African Americans to serve on the federal bench. 62. This included 9 African American circuit court judges, including 26 African American women appointed to the federal court, which, by the way, is more African American women appointed by any president in history. I mean, I could go to the health care. The Democrats pushed for the Affordable Care Act. And if you look at the Affordable Care Act, I would have said to the troll, you had roughly 9 million African Americans uninsured who now will have health insurance through the Affordable Care Act. And what we do know the Republican Party did was what? They fought it tooth and nail every single time. Department of Justice, the Democrats investigated several police departments as shootings of unarmed black men by officers, and deaths in custody became epidemic, and again led to the Black Lives Matter. And that slogan, what did Republicans say? Oh, it's racist. No, it wasn't. Black Lives Matter, I'll say it again. It was a statement of focus, not exclusion. Let me repeat. It was a statement of focus, not exclusion. And almost every single Republican candidate for office and existing office holder said, and the social media is full of their comments. It's a racist statement, but it's not. It's focus, not exclusion, because, yes, we know all lives matter. Unemployment, 7.9%, and I know the Trump folks are talking about unemployment is down, but I just read a Bloomberg report where, yes, unemployment is down, but guess what happened with this $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthy? Wages are down. There's a report out today. I spent about a half an hour today on my show talking about it, Tom. Wages are not only stagnant, they're down. And most of the money from the tax cut went to the super wealthy that you talk about every single day. But under Democratic leadership, just recent, and I'm talking about recent now, I'm not going to go back into history, recent black poverty declined by a net of 23.6 percentage points. But by the way, grew, now get this, by 3 points when Republicans held the White House. Now, I'm not, this is facts. And that's part of the problem when you're dealing with trolls. They don't want to deal with facts. And I don't know how you argue whether you got 5 seconds left or 5 hours left, because if you give them a fact, if I tell you this is a telephone I'm talking on, and they tell you that it's a bullhorn, then what do we do? I mean, we can't argue, and so that's why I really don't argue with them, because they're there. And I will say one other thing, and I think I mentioned this to you the other day. The indictment of some 12 Russian generals, I believe, assigned by Putin. We know that's a fact. They targeted African American social media and talk radio, and the person who showed me the 3 or 4 pages in the indictment said to me, and this is a person who is well established in the intelligence community, said to me, look, Russians are good. They're very good at doing this, and they've been doing it a long time, but they aren't that good that they know how to communicate with the African American community. So I'm not surprised that you got that call, because it's the same call I've got, but anybody can Google the information that I just shared with you in, less than 5 minutes.
Sure, and did a great job of it. The one particular peril is the wrong word because it makes me sound like a victim, but as a white guy talking to an African American who's asking, what have the Democrats done for you? And then I say, well, civil rights, or look at the makeup of the Republican caucus. You've only got one black senator, one black member of the House, and neither one of them want to join the
Congressional Black Caucus.
Yeah, exactly. It comes across as condescending, or as, how dare you even ask me? Like it comes across sounding like some kind of super white privilege or something, and I'm sure that's how I came across sounding. How do I deal with that?
I mean, I didn't hear the conversation. Quite honestly,
yeah, I can send you the clip.
I wouldn't really. I would stick with facts.
Yeah.
That's exactly. Look, the reality is that. Look, I heard your show the other day when you played, and I've played this a lot. Lee Atwater's Southern Strategy.
Yeah.
And see, here's what they'll do. They'll call in and say, well, Democrats were racist. Yes, they were. They were for from the end of the post-Civil War until probably about the time that Truman integrated the armed forces, which led then to more integration with Eisenhower, and then of course the Democrats through Humphrey, the pendulum swung towards civil rights, the labor movement, and then what happened? Dixiecrats, who were Democrats, Southern Democrats, were invited to join the Republican Party. You have that audio clip. You have
of Lee?
Lee
yeah, I can play it right now if you'd like.
Well, go ahead, and he talks about how to make race abstract. It'll do the same thing, but it's abstract.
Yeah, actually, the one I've got, I'm looking at the waveform on it, and I'm not sure that it's been beeped.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician, like political science, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not. Is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this, huh? You start out in 1954 by saying,
yeah, we did.
By 1968, you can't say that hurts or backfire, so you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff.
And then he goes on and he says, and then you get into economic issues, which hurt black folks more than white folks, and now you're totally abstract.
Now you're totally abstract, and I cut my political teeth. We're about the same age on that period of time.
Yep. And
so the Dixiecrats then joined the Republican Party, and then went from there to the Tea Party. And we tend to forget that on inauguration night, let me go back to what the Democrats have done.
We have about 40 seconds, Joe, just until we hit a heartbreak.
They're not perfect. They're not perfect. But I tell you, if I were a Republican and a coal miner, I'd be wondering why they haven't helped coal miners that are now dying of black lung disease. And I could list a few other things that Republicans ought to be asking.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, that's pretty important stuff. What has the Republican Party done for you?
Thank you.
I mean, this is it's pretty incredible. Joe, thanks so much for dropping in, and I know that you've got to get to something else, but I really appreciate you dropping in and discussing this with us.
Thank you. Anytime, Tom.
Joe Madison, the great Joe Madison. You can hear him on Sirius XM channel 129 every morning, weekdays, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Civil and human rights activist. JoeMadison.com is his website. Madison Sirius XM is his Twitter handle. We'll be back. It's 18 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. What has the Democratic Party done for you, whoever you may be, lately? And what more would you like it to do?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Excuse me, Joe's on channel 126 on Sirius XM, not 129, channel 126. And welcome back. Oh my, let's see here. Omar in Herndon, Virginia. Hey, Omar, what's on your mind?
Tom, how you doing today? I hope just to answer a question, what the Democrats have done. I think the most important thing is health care and also the equal pay for women. So the Democrat does a lot. I mean, comparing the Democrat to Republican, it's like apple and oranges. And what we need to do is just need to galvanize the Democratic Party because their ideas, they help the common man. And Tom, you always say that the Republican Party, and I agree with 100%, is for the rich and these corporate billionaires who have no interest. All they're interested about is getting money for their wallet. So the Democratic Party is the party of the common man. And I just wanted to say that.
Okay.
But I wanted to talk about the war. And I'm very concerned that we're going to end up going to a war with Iran. Mm-hmm. Because I just read an article in Al Hayat. It's an editorial by a journalist who covered the war in Yemen, and he's basically said that the Saudis are getting frustrated because the war in Yemen is becoming like Vietnam to them. They're losing a lot of manpower and they're using a lot of money, and they're trying to bomb their way out to victory.
Right.
And they're trying to drag the United States in by basically telling the American, look, you guys plan to attack Iran anyway. Why don't you start in Yemen? You know,
well, we're already in. I mean, we're flying the air refueling planes for the Saudi Air Force. I mean, you know, we're helping them. We're helping them with their bombing of Yemen, which has created a massive refugee crisis, killed thousands of people, displaced over 500,000, maybe as many as 1 million people on the brink of starvation right now. There's a major cholera epidemic going on because they bombed, you know, critical infrastructure for clean water and things. I mean, this is a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions, Omar.
It is, and they want but the Saudis, they want troops. They want special operation troops in Yemen.
Well, don't they have a few hundred of us right now?
They do have some, but they really want the United States to get involved because they're not winning the war, and they're losing a lot of manpower, and it's almost like becoming Vietnam to them.
You know, in my mind, Omar, I was thinking when the Saudis, you know, went after Yemen like that, I was wondering, is this a rehearsal for Iran?
Wow. That is a good point. That is absolutely, and I think it's a rehearsal point. And the second point in the editorial that he talked about is that basically the Israelis think that if they don't attack Iran right now, they will never get a chance. I mean, the perfect opportunity is under Trump administration. And I think it's just a matter of time before they attack Iran. And then once Iran attack Israel, the United States are going to get engaged in the war to try to defend Israel.
Yeah, and that's how I see it playing out too. And I'm concerned that both Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu are both. Netanyahu's under explicit indictment. He's been indicted for crimes, as has his wife. Trump is on the edge of being indicted for crimes. So both of them are in a position where if they could get their countries into a war, people would be more inclined to pay attention to the war and rally around the flag than to go, they committed crimes? Really? You're corrupt? You know? And
yeah, exactly. And that would be just like what George Bush did in 2004. And that's the third point that he pointed out, that Trump might feel like he want to get reelected, and then his strategy is just to go into a war.
Yeah. And Trump, in fact, suggested back in 2011 that President Obama was going to bomb Iran in order to get in order to push the elections of 2012. It's bizarre how this guy thinks. Omar, thank you for the call. Good to hear from you. We'll be back. It's 22 and a half minutes past the hour. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at tomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. 24 and a half minutes past the hour. And Sereno in New Haven, Connecticut. Hey, Sereno, what's up?
Hello, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Sure. I just wanted to chime in on the trolls that are cranking up again. I've called in before about this, and I also listen to Joe Madison. I do consulting, and I travel back and forth between the United States and Asia a lot on business. And one thing I've noticed in my position is I've seen the chain mails that go back and forth with the talking points that trolls use. And I notice when I'm online, because we have to protect our networks and we use various tools. When I'm online, we can see the dissemination of the chain mails that carry the talking point.
Wow.
So when I listen to your show and I hear a caller call up with those talking points, I've seen them on paper before they've called you. And the same for Joe Madison's show. They have the exact same talking points. And for Joe's show one time, I actually emailed him the email itself that I just, grabbed off of individual's PC. Now, as an IT professional, we can't act on that email when a user receives it. We can only act if someone disseminates it from a work computer. But I can tell you this, hundreds and hundreds of employees for companies all over, they get the same chain email. And
so this is this something that happens like if you join a Facebook group or a website or some sort of discussion group that is hard right, they've got your email address and you start getting this stuff in email?
You have to be down the rabbit hole pretty far to get some of the emails that we've gleaned.
Yeah.
And when I say I'm thinking more in terms of 4chan, where people meet, and 4chan, the whole purpose is it goes away by itself after a while, but people feel each other out, and then it progresses over to other websites like Reddit, and from there to Facebook groups, and it's a pretty loose-knit organization, but the hub of the operation stays consistent. And even if they'll discard an email address, so they still get the new email address to disseminate the new talking point.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. Sereno, thank you for the call, and thanks for the information. And but let's even if that guy was not a troll, and I thought he was, Joe thought he was, but who knows? Maybe he was just an honest guy who got that message from a troll and was like, hey, here's a serious question. We have to consider the answers.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And it has to be better answers than, hey, buddy, you got civil rights. Stop bothering me. That's not going to work. The Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This is an 1856 first English translation edition of this author. And but you can still get it online. A lot of different booksellers sell it. This is from chapter 11. What sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear? I had remarked during my stay in the United States that a democratic state of society, similar to that of the Americans, might offer singular facilities for the establishment of despotism. And I perceived, upon my return to Europe, how much use had already been made by most of our rulers of the notions, the sentiments, and the wants engendered by this same social condition for the purpose of extending the circle of their power. This led me to think that the nations of Christendom would perhaps eventually undergo some sort of oppression like that which hung over several of the nations of the ancient world. But it would seem that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it might assume a different character, different from the Roman Empire, for example. It might be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them. I do not question that in an age of instruction and equality like our own, sovereigns might more easily succeed in collecting all political power into their own hands and might interfere more habitually and decidedly within the circle of private interests than any sovereign of antiquity ever could do. But the same principle of equality which facilitates despotism tempers its rigor. When no member of the community has much power or much wealth, tyranny is, as it were, without opportunities or a field of action. As all fortunes are scanty, the passions of men are naturally circumscribed, their imagination limited, their pleasures simple. This universal moderation moderates the sovereign himself and checks within certain limits the inordinate stretch of his own desires. Independently of these reasons, drawn from the nature of the state of society itself, I might add many others arising from causes beyond my subject, but I shall keep within the limits I have laid down to myself. Democratic governments may become violent and even cruel at certain periods of extreme effervescence or of great danger. Excuse me, think of George Bush and 9/11. But these crises will be rare and brief. When I consider the petty passions of our contemporaries, the mildness of their manners, the extent of their education, the purity of their religion, the gentleness of their morality, their regular and industrious habits, and the restraint with which they almost all observe in their vices, no less than in their virtues, I have no fear that they will meet with tyrants in their rulers, but rather guardians. I think then that the species of oppression by which democratic nations are menaced is unlike anything that ever existed before in our world. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I am trying myself to choose an expression which will accurately convey the whole of the idea I have formed of it, but in vain. The old words, despotism and tyranny, are inappropriate. The thing itself is new, and since I cannot name it, I must attempt to define it. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observation is an immutable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Think now of a television society. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists, but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. Facebook? That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that people should rejoice, providing that they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. I have always thought that the servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind, which I have just described, might be combined more easily than is commonly believed with some of the outward forms of freedom, and that it might even establish itself under the wing of the sovereign of the people. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions. They want to be led, and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite. They console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. And it continues. It's a brilliant book, A Democracy in America.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook.
We're going to do Anything Goes Summer. Summer is, we do this every year, and summer is traditionally kind of a slow time in terms of people calling in. You know, they're not so much in their car driving to work or whatever, and whatever it may be. And so from now until, what is it, Labor Day? Sean? Yeah, Labor Day. I don't do holidays well. But until then, we'll do Anything Goes Summer. But so you can be off topic if you call in. But I think that there's some important stuff here. Number one, we're talking about, you know, the Democratic Party and the whole issue of race and you know, what, and the Republican Party for that matter as well. The other thing I'd like to introduce into this conversation, I just retweeted Donald Trump's attack on Barack Obama from November of 2011. And what Trump was suggesting was that, keep in mind, Obama was first elected in 2008. He was up for re-election in 2012. In November, when Trump tweeted this, President Obama was starting to go into campaign mode for his re-election. And Trump tweeted, and the reason I'm sharing this with you is I think this gives you an insight into how Donald Trump thinks, which should scare the hell out of all of us. Donald Trump tweeted on November 29, 2011, and it's still on his Twitter feed, in order to get elected, Barack Obama will start a war with Iran. That was Donald Trump. So, just FYI. Steve in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Nice to talk to you again, and you're one of the very best.
Thank you.
Been with you for 10 years, and I love it. Omar, I just want to piggyback on what Omar had to say, and basically the Dems, they are for the common man. You know, we just need to take race out of the equation. What have the Dems done for us? Well, let's look to, Social Security, the Environmental Protection Agency, which protects the food and water, Medicare, unemployment insurance, a 40-hour work week, the OSHA workplace and protection plans, all the things that FDR laid into place. We used to have 99 weeks of unemployment insurance in this country, and when the recovery was just starting to get underway, the Republicans, they ended up taking it down to 26 weeks.
Right.
That's a far cry. You get 6 months versus 2 years.
Yeah. No, I remember it well. And Steve, I mean, on the one hand, yes, anything that benefits human beings is going to benefit African Americans and other minorities. Exactly. On the other hand, as a group who are still under assault, for example, I've got this story from the Grief by Kia Morgan Smith. Family calls beloved man's murder at family reunion a hate crime. Frederick Taft was at the Pan American Park with 40 or 50 family members, African American guy with at a family reunion, right, in California, and in the San Diego area, I believe. And he goes to the bathroom. He's a 57-year-old truck driver, and he goes to the bathroom, and a white guy walks into the bathroom with a rifle and shoots him dead, and then just walks off. They had identified the guy as carrying a rifle, wearing khaki shorts, calf-high socks, and a fishing hat. The police are saying, we haven't, literally, quote, we haven't uncovered any evidence of a hate crime, end quote. But his daughter, the mother of his daughter, says it wasn't a robbery. They didn't take his wallet. What else could it have been? And after the shooting, another family, reported to Taft's relatives that they were harassed earlier in the park by a group of white men on bicycles who hurled racial slurs at them. So, you've got a group of people who have some very real and legitimate concerns, and that go beyond simply the things that affect all the rest of us, in quotes, that affect white people as well. And I think that those are worthy of separate or included examination.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, Trump is he's allowed the dog whistle to go full bore.
Well, I think that's what's happening here. I think, and you said it very well, Steve. Thank you for the call. I think that that's exactly what's happening here. Is Trump is activating, what some kind of a war here, tearing people apart in the United States. This is his electoral strategy. Deborah in Seattle, you're on the air, Deborah.
Hi. So I wanted to just kind of talk about the conversation that Joe Madison had. I have much respect for Joe, and I know he's a original talk show host from a line of many. But one of the things that I do disagree with him on is the fact that we are asking that question. There's a lot of people, especially, I'm a black woman and I live in Seattle, and I try to tap into different groups and things of that nature. And so one of the biggest questions is, like, we feel like we're just, being taken for our vote. We're it's almost for granted that we're going to vote for a Democrat. And in the past, that's the way I was taught by my mom, was to do it that way. But now that my eyes are open, I'm like 51 now, I'm starting to see a lot of things that aren't, in my best interest, even though I keep voting,
for example,
over and over. Well, I mean, like, let's just say, for instance, the issue with the Stand Your Ground law, with the incident in Florida. One of the things I listened to a lot of talk show, and I listened to Warren Ballantyne, and he's a good person to really tap into if you ever wanted to have a guest on your show, because this morning he was talking about the Stand Your Ground law, and he gave us some homework to do in terms of figure out, if you have one in your state, and if you do, see if the representative in your state, supports it.
Right, but Deborah, you know where the Stand Your Ground laws came from. These were ALEC laws. This is stuff that came out of the Koch brothers, ALEC group, the American Legislative Exchange Council. There was ALEC model legislation that was put together by, basically the NRA and white gun promoting groups, and taken to the states, and has only been put into place in Republican states. So, the Stand Your Ground law is a great example. Democrats have been fighting Stand Your Ground from day one. And we just had this incident down in Florida a couple of days ago where a black guy was shot, I believe, by a white guy for parking in the handicapped place while he was sitting in the car waiting for his wife to come out of a store. And he came out, and the white guy was hassling him, and he pushed the guy down to the ground, and the white guy pulls out a gun and shoots him dead. And the police say, hey, it's not a crime because of the Stand Your Ground law. Well, that's courtesy of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I totally understand that, but it's almost like when we vote Democrat, it's like, and I'm not trying to be hate-filled or anything like that, but the whole black demographic, or native black, however you want to call it, we are not being represented, and it's almost like we feel like we're at the bottom. We always have to vote a certain kind of way because that's the way they program us, but in the end,
Deborah,
okay.
I'm asking for one single example of where, from your point of view, the Republican Party is doing a better job for people of color, specifically for African Americans, than the Democratic Party is. Because it looks to me like the Democratic Party is doing a fair.
I don't think they're doing. I don't agree with the Republicans at all. I'm just voicing my opinion that there's a lot of frustration with.
So what would you like the Democratic Party to do differently?
I would like for them to actually, I would like to be able to present an agenda
for example,
from us. Just
one thing that you'd like the Democrats to do differently, please.
One thing that I would like would probably be to be able to, do something with the policing of black people. I'm just getting sick and tired of seeing people from my tribe get killed.
The Democrats in the House committee that oversees, and I forget which committee it is, but that it functionally oversees that process, have been calling for hearings for several years now in the House of Representatives, where they can bring these police officers in, where they can talk about national policing standards. The Republicans will have nothing to do with it. So the Democrats are actually addressing, to the extent that they can, given the limited power that they have, and there's been some substantial change in a number of states, California, for example, tightening up their laws. And right now there's a bill in the California legislature, we talked about it yesterday on the air, that redefines how police, under what circumstances police can use deadly force. And it's all about stopping the killing of unarmed black people. The Democrats are all over that. They're pushing this. I'm still waiting for even one thing, Deborah, where you're unsatisfied with what the Democrats do or that you want them to do differently.
I'm just, I guess my biggest thing, Tom, is they say, they come to us and they say, well, we're going to do this, that, and the other. And then when it comes down to it and everything just washes out, there was nothing.
So you don't have one thing that you want to specifically talk about. You just want to generally bash the Democratic Party. That's the kind of thing that makes me think I'm talking to a troll, Deborah.
No, I'm not trying to bash them because I've been voting Democratic for the longest because I know at the end of the day that's a better choice.
If I was your Democratic representative, what would you ask me to do that would defy the Democratic Party on behalf of African Americans?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I would like to be able to have us at the table, as far as different demographics, not, I guess I'm trying not to bring in anyone else.
Well, okay, but look at the Congressional Black Caucus, there are 2 Republican African Americans, Mia Love out of Utah and Tim Scott, I think, from North Carolina, and one in the House, one in the Senate. And the Black Caucus welcomed them, open arms. Hey, come on in, join us. And they said, no, not our thing.
Yeah, and I don't have any belief system in the Congressional Black Caucus. I feel like everybody, the old timers need to sit down and let some new blood into the program. But that's a whole nother topic.
Well, I think we're all in favor of new blood. Deborah, I got to run. Thank you for the call.
Okay, thank you.
Good talking with you. 45 minutes past the hour. We'll continue the conversation after this. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. Fair and only slightly unbalanced. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Let's see here. Gary in Eugene, Oregon, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Gary, what's up?
Good morning, Tom. Glad to talk with you.
Thank you.
My issue is somewhat related to the last caller in the fact that I just find the Democratic hierarchy is a little bit vague, and that's one issue. But, you had Bernie Sanders on your show for many years, and Bernie, talks to me through the email, and, he has his, opinions. And I've never heard you talk derogatorily towards Mr. Sanders. And yet, I see people and shows, even on Free Speech TV, where they go at Bernie continually. Bernie's over. That's passed, and yet there's still, some of these issues about, who he voted for and sure. how he, denigrated the opposition, the other candidate. I see, circular firing squad. And they say in one side of their mouth, it's all blue, but then, they come back and they just can't let that go. What are your opinions about that? I know you had a strong, and I believe you still have strong feelings towards Bernie. Could you,
Sure. What is happening, Gary, and this has, in my opinion, does not have a lot to do with race, although, I haven't thought that through. Maybe it does.
Gender?
But no. What's happening is that in 1991, Al Fromm came up with this idea that the Democratic Party was in bad shape because the Reagan's war on the unions was being successful. We had seen union membership just in a 15 or 20 year period go from a high of around a third of all workers in the United States to, at that time, around 12 or 14%. And that had by more than half wiped out the money that the Democratic Party was getting nationally from unions, and which was, of course, the Republican strategy. So Al Fromm said, instead of relying on working people for our funds, we need to start relying, like Willie Sutton famously said, when they asked him, why do you rob banks? He said, that's where the money is. And so Al Fromm said, well, let's get in bed with the banks and the insurance companies. At least they're clean. They're not like the oil companies or the gun manufacturers who, are killing people. And so the Democratic Party took this huge step in 92 with the election of Bill Clinton, and in 93 and through 2000 with his presidency. It took this huge step toward being basically the party of the white-collar, upper-income American, the top 10%, and clean, in quotes, corporate interests, particularly Silicon Valley clean. They loved Silicon Valley stuff. And that has degraded the Democratic Party's ability to defend average working people. The other 90% of us have been kind of lost by that. And now you've got a whole bunch of Democrats being led by Bernie who are saying, we want to go back to the values of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, the core values of the Democratic Party, that we're here for the working class, we're here for the average person, and we're here definitely for the downtrodden, for the oppressed. And you've got that group, and that's, you know, the new progressive, the so-called far left, you know, used Stephanie Ruhl's phrase. And then you've got, you know, the guys who've been in the Democratic Party since 92, made the deals with the corporations, have had their campaigns funded by Citibank all these years, and all of a sudden they're looking at, you know, being pushed out, and they're freaking out. And they just had a major invitation-only meeting of about 250 of these people in New York the day before yesterday. And this last weekend. They're planning their strategy. Gary, I got to run. Thanks. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair chair, office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at tomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
On these topics here, Ken in New Oxford, Pennsylvania. Hey, Ken, what's on your mind?
Hey, thanks, Tom, for honoring the First Amendment of the Constitution by allowing me to speak.
Well, actually, it's not, because I'm not the government. But
Oh, you are. The government will not allow me to speak. That's the truth.
Okay. So what's up, Ken?
What I want to bring is that, remember, the Republicans put the token black Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court. And remember, Republican Arlen Specter, who was a Democrat also, never apologized to Anita Hill, who was a black woman, nor has Clarence Thomas ever apologized to Anita Hill.
Well, I think that would require an admission of guilt, which he's unwilling to do.
Well, of course. And of course,
if he's innocent, that's legitimate.
He was in the pocket of Anthony Scalia, okay? Because this is true. Father Paul Scalia, who is a priest and the son of Anthony Scalia, was able to proselytize on the U.S. Supreme Court to bring Clarence back into the Catholic fold.
Yeah, Clarence. He did convert to Catholicism.
Brett Kavanaugh, who's now being considered, been nominated, another good Catholic, and I'm sure he will be in the pockets. Well, he'll have Clarence Thomas in his pocket. And remember, have we ever heard a verbal argument or even a verbal question from Clarence Thomas?
Yeah, but that doesn't, I'm going to stop this right here, Ken, because I'm just going to move along. Lynn in Silver Spring, Maryland. Hey, Lynn, what's up?
Hi, Tom.
Hey, Lynn.
I just wanted to call to discuss this issue. I think you're asking the wrong question when you're talking about African Americans and what have the Democrats have done or have not done. Obviously, Democratic policies benefit most people who are going to be lower income, poor people. That goes without saying. But the issue that, as I observe it from an African American point of view, is that there's no sense of urgency. There's this feeling that we have to wait our turn, And I also believe, look, I've been listening to your show since the early 90s in California when Bernie was on the radio, every Friday. And it was frustrating to me why other African Americans were not in support of Bernie, but I realized what it is because he really didn't address black people specifically. And there is just this sense of, we know you're going to vote for us, so we're going to push all this other legislation forward first, and you guys just have to wait. Or when there's a public issue where there are African Americans, we need support publicly, there's a hesitancy of the Democratic politicians to step forward for fear of whatever race baiting or for fear of whatever the being accused by a Republican of identity politics.
Right.
And so there's just this, it's insidious like racism. It's not any specific policy issue that's the problem. The problem is when issues come up that address black people specifically, there's also not an overwhelming support or response, especially by mainstream Democrats, to say, okay, we understand this is a racial issue. We understand that obviously race is affecting this, and let's, move forward and address it. This is kind of like, well, I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah, we have more in this election, this November election that's coming up. There are more African American women running for political office than in the history of the United States, as far as I can tell. I've seen this and it seems to me like that's probably the best solution to the problem. Is more people getting involved who live and breathe the problem, who understand, who have an intimate knowledge of it.
Agreed.
I don't know what else to say. I mean, if you could speak to the head of the Democratic Party, what would you say in terms of here's what you need to do different, other than, let's get more African Americans and particularly African American women, but more African Americans into positions of power?
I just feel like there needs to be more of some kind of public statement rather than retreating from issues around race. Mm-hmm. There needs to be more of a concerted effort or public statements that we understand that racism exists, because there are some Democratic politicians who just won't touch the issue because it's too sensitive for them. Yeah. There needs to be some kind of public understanding or statement by, leaders of the Democratic Party of, we understand there's a sense of urgency for you. We are here for you. We will support, that public statement does not happen. And for me, that's the bigger issue, not the policies.
It's part of the Democratic platform.
What?
To fight racism and to fight racist laws and to promote the interests of minorities in the United States and all that kind of stuff.
Correct. But what people notice are media responses, right? What people notice are, just public shows of support for, when something goes down publicly, that's obviously very racist, like you just talked about, the gentleman who was shot in the Stand Your Ground law. And, I don't watch a whole lot of mainstream news or media, but I don't see politicians coming out and saying, aside from maybe like a Cory Booker, this is terrible. What are we going to do to just even asking the question?
Lynn, that music means we're out of time. Lynn, thanks so much for the call. It's great to hear from you. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at tomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, THOM. In the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from American Holocaust by David Stannard, The Conquest of the New World. This is from the prologue. Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. It took a little longer, about the span of a single human generation, but what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshimas, and Hispaniola was only the beginning. Within no more than a handful of generations following their first encounters with the Europeans, the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere's native peoples had been exterminated. The pace and magnitude of their obliteration varied from place to place and from time to time, but for years, now historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbia depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% in Native American population has become a working rule of thumb. What this means is that, on average, for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, when the lands of the Americans teemed with numerous tens of millions of people, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over. To put this in a contemporary context, the ratio of native survivorship in the Americas following European contact was less than half of what the human survivorship ratio would be in the United States today if every single white person and every single black person died. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. That is why, as one historian aptly has said, far from the heroic and romantic heraldry that customarily is used to symbolize the European settlement of the Americas, the emblem most congruent with reality would be a pyramid of skulls. Scholars estimate the size of the post-Columbian Holocaust have climbed sharply in recent decades. Too often, however, academic discussions of this ghastly event have reduced the devastated indigenous people and their cultures to statistical calculations in reconciling demographic analyses. It was easy for this to happen. From the very beginning, merely taking the account of so mammoth a cataclysm seemed an impossible task, wrote one Spanish adventurer who arrived in the New World only 2 decades after Columbus's first landing, and who himself openly reveled in the torrent of native blood. There was neither, quote, paper nor time enough to tell all that the conquistadors did to ruin the Indians and rob them and destroy the land, end quote. As a result, the very effort to describe the disaster's overwhelming magnitude has tended to obliterate both the writer's and the reader's sense of its truly horrific human element. In an apparent effort to counteract this tendency, one writer, Tsvetsan Todorov, began his study of the events of 1492 and immediately thereafter with an epigraph from Diego de Landa's Relación de las Casas de Yucatán. Quote, the captain, Alonso López de Avila, brother-in-law of the Adelmento de Montejo, captured during the war in Bacalan a young Indian woman of lovely and gracious appearance. She had promised her husband, fearful lest they should kill him in the war, not to have relations with any other man but him, and so no persuasion was sufficient to prevent her from taking her own life to avoid being defiled by another man. And because of this, they had her thrown to the dogs. Toborov then dedicates his book to the memory of a Mayan woman devoured by dogs. It is important to try and hold in mind an image of that woman and her brothers and sisters and the innumerable others who suffered similar fates as one reads Todorov's book, or this one, or any other work on this subject, just as it is essential, as one reads about the Jewish Holocaust or the horrors of the African slave trade, to keep in mind the treasure of a single life in order to avoid becoming emotionally anesthetized by the sheer force of such overwhelming human evil and destruction. There is, for example, a case of a small Indian boy whose name no one knows today, and whose unmarked skeletal remains are hopelessly intermingled with those of hundreds of anonymous others in a mass grave on the American plains, but a boy who once played on the banks of a quiet creek in eastern Colorado, until the morning in 1864, when the American soldiers came. Then, as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all of the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. Quote, "There was one child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and drop his rifle and fire, but he missed the child. Another man came up and said, 'Let me try the son of a bitch, I can hit him.' He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed him too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped." We must do what we can to recapture and try to understand in human terms what it was that was crushed, what it was that was butchered. It is not enough merely to acknowledge that much was lost. So close to total was the human incineration and carnage. And it continues.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hi, Thom Hartmann here with you. Welcome back to the second hour of our program. I just, apropos of our last hour, and then we'll get to Jamal Abdi in just a moment, but apropos of our last hour, Dynasty Shadrealm just tweeted to me. He said, "Tom, what I feel Democrats haven't done, reparations, African Americans listed as a protected class, police reform, African American contracts for construction and other projects in their community." Police reform, as I pointed out, is something that's on, big on the screen of the Democratic Party, and in fact is moving forward very rapidly in California. But nationally, I haven't seen that much, and I think that's a pretty good list as a starting point. But, let's also talk about Iran. I closed the last hour, or toward the end of the last hour, quoting a tweet from Donald Trump in 2011 when Barack Obama was about to run for re-election. And he tweeted, "In order to get elected, Barack Obama will start a war with Iran." So Donald Trump, back in 2011, 7 years ago, was thinking, gee, for an American politician to get reelected in the United States, one of the best things he could do is have a war with Iran. And if he didn't think that was something that would be successful politically, he wouldn't attribute it to Barack Obama, right? I mean, it's just kind of rational. So, Trump has already told us how he thinks about this, that war with Iran is a good thing in terms of politics. I'm curious Jamal Abdi's thoughts on this. He's the Vice President for Policy at NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, and the Executive Director of NIAC Action. The website, niac.org, and and you can tweet him at jabdi, A-B-D-I. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Tom.
So, what is your take on my take about Donald Trump's 2011 tweet, and how does that inform your thinking on what Trump is up to right now, and what's your analysis of the current state of affairs? Is this all bluster, or could we be looking down the barrel of World War III? There's a lot there. Feel free to go off.
So we're spending a lot of time trying to assess the motivations behind this, and of course other actions by this president. And it's always a matter of not wanting to fall into a trap of actually thinking that there's a strategy behind some of this stuff. And so for this, I don't know if this was coordinated, if this was planned out, or if this was a spur-of-the-moment decision that he made. This tweet came on the heels of a speech by his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in California, aimed at Iranian Americans. He invited Iranian Americans to attend the speech. It was at the Reagan Library, where he was effectively making the case for regime change without saying regime change, and actually, actively saying, we don't seek regime change, we just seek all of these changes in the regime. And I'm now speaking to an audience of Iranian Americans and dissidents and people like that. And so for this to come right after that, it feels like it's part of a coordinated move. John Bolton, who I think he and Pompeo are similarly hawkish about Iran. Pompeo, I think, is a little bit more practical, whereas Bolton is more ideological and has been advocating for bombing Iran very explicitly for years. And then you have Mattis, who is also with Pompeo in California, who is against going to war with Iran. He wants to challenge Iran in other ways. And so what I'm trying to figure out here is, the day after this tweet came out, John Bolton went to great lengths to reiterate that this was the president's position, and he went and did press on the tweet itself instead of trying to walk it back or explain away why the president would do this. He was really emphasizing this. And to me, that means that John Bolton may be the one behind this, trying to get this president to take a more provocative position towards Iran.
Bolton, who editorialized in the Washington Post a year or three ago that the best way to stop Iran from having a bomb is to bomb Iran.
Yes. One of the few people, there are many people in Washington who want to go in that direction. He's one of the rare people who will actually say it publicly, which I appreciate him for. But to get to what you're talking about, sort of the political dimensions of this, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. There's some wag the dog going on where he's got numerous scandals involving Russia and his lawyer and all these other things.
Well, and so does Bibi Netanyahu, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, they both have a strong incentive to change the conversation away from the crimes that they're both being charged with.
Yeah, yes. And, I think I think Trump is a student of politics, maybe not an A student, but he's got a knack. And I think he knows what this type of, this preparation for war would do for him politically. But I really think that there's sort of some back and forth going on inside the White House about sort of what this Iran policy actually is. They're rolling it out as they're sort of figuring out what the end game is, I think.
At the same time, Pompeo in his speech talked about how corrupt the current Iranian government is, how the Grand Ayatollah has amassed billions of dollars and stashed it offshore, that a number of these people are who rule the country are basically kleptocrats. How are the Iranian? First of all, is there truth to that? And secondly, what's the best way to deal with that? I get it. It's really none of our business how Iran runs its own internal affairs until it starts, interfering with us. But what does? Well, I guess I've asked my question. Toss it back to you.
Well, what Pompeo said. Some of it was exaggerated, much of it was true. The question is the messenger. I mean, this is an administration that cares about the leaders of government benefiting from their service. I think they need to look in the mirror. And then, they want to talk about human rights and all these other things. Well, we are cozying up with some of the greatest abusers of human rights in the region. So I think these points are true, and actually these are points that resonate with Iranians, which is, I think very much calculated by Pompeo and the administration as the reason for going out with this messaging, even though it rings so hypocritical when you look at what all they're doing. But, there were protests in Iran at the end of last year. There have been some ongoing protests, mostly about the economy. But what really triggered them, or helped trigger them, was the revelation of how much of the Iranian budget is going to these private foundations of some of the clerics and the religious leaders and things like that. And so when these revelations have come out, this is actually something that does mobilize Iranians who are not doing well economically to come out against the government.
Does it mobilize them to in a way that would be productive, like Americans saying, hey, look at how Jeff Bezos is now the richest man in the world, and yet a third of his employees in California or in Arizona or wherever it was are on food stamps. And maybe we should legislatively do something about that, like forcing a raise in the minimum wage or allowing unions. That seems like a productive response, as opposed to an unproductive response, which would be, I'm furious about this, just tear the thing down, right? And which leads to chaos and that sort of thing.
Right, absolutely. And then the other dynamic here is it's not as if an American news source or some trusted journalist is coming out and saying this is a political tool. This is as if Putin or Ayatollah Khamenei came out with this line about Bezos and or about corruption in the American system, precisely to destabilize the system, not to actually come up with any solution to it. So really, what this does, by co-opting this message that is resonant among some of the opposition in Iran, the U.S. is really taking that away from them. It's very hard to organize around these things if it is, rightly perceived as being something orchestrated by an outside, foreign government, which is sensitive in any context, but particularly in Iran and the lessons of U.S. interventions in the region, not to mention, the U.S. toppling of the democratically elected prime minister in Iran in 1953. So this is very self-serving. I don't think it actually does anything positive for the people of Iran or even the opposition.
So this is probably hurting the reformers. And would you consider Rouhani a reformer rather than helping them?
Would I consider him a reformer? I think he's a moderate. He's not really a true member of the reformists, but he kind of balances between the different factions and definitely has trended that way on certain issues.
Yeah, fascinating. So what can Americans do to prevent war with Iran, assuming that that's a desirable thing? To prevent a war.
Well, the silver lining here is that once the cat's out of the bag, we can actually organize against it. So I was watching this campaign unfold of regime change and setting the stage for something really ugly. And if it's happening in private, it's hard to actually get people mobilized around it. So at this point in time, we need lawmakers to be hearing from their constituents about how disturbed and upset they are by this and express their hope that lawmakers will actually push back against this. And already we are hearing a lot of members of Congress pushing back against the tweet. But we need to make this a political loss for the president and for anybody who's advocating for military action or U.S.-led regime change in Iran or anywhere else, frankly.
Yeah, sounds like a solid thing. Jamal Abdi is the Vice President for Policy at the National Iranian American Council, NIAC. NIAC.org is the website. Jamal, thanks so much for dropping by today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
I appreciate an in-depth conversation. It's very, very considerate of you. Thank you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day, your calls, and my thoughts on all the above in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be right back with more of your calls right after this. And welcome back. Jeffrey in Miami, Florida, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Jeffrey, what's up?
Hey, hi, Tom. I'm not disagreeing with you, but we.
Oh, this is Jesse, not Jeffrey. Hey, Jesse. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she gets my name wrong sometimes. I'll be on speakerphone, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, the Democrats are hypocrites, and the hypocrisy is very, very deep, and it goes back to the Founding Fathers when they said freedom, prosperity for all, and all they was really talking about was the property owners.
Yeah.
It applies today. The Republicans and the Democrats represent the property owners, and then tokenism is given to white and blacks. far as the 99% is concerned. And basically, if the Democrats really want to be taken for real and just be Democrats, represent the people, not what the founding fathers represent, people of property, and then throw some peanuts to the have-nots, and then just as quick as they throw it to them, just as quick as they could take it away. So that's why it's always a struggle to say, well, we want this, we want that.
Yeah.
And then the Dems and the Republicans say, okay, you all made enough noise here. Let's give you a few tokens to shut you up. So,
but Jesse, isn't that how politics has always worked? I mean, whether it was women trying to get the vote, whether it was African Americans trying to get freedom and then get the vote, and now achieve economic parity, whether it's people who are trying to stop nuclear power plants, whether it's people who are trying, it's like all of these people who were agitating to create an agency inside the government to protect our environment after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire back in the early 70s. Or late 60s. It seems, and I lived through the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it seems like at every step of the way, power never cedes power or wealth unless demands are placed on it. And so, of course, a noisy minority has to be noisy, and when they get something, sometimes it's a token in as much as it is really nothing that they're getting. It's just to be perceived as something. But sometimes they actually get something, and
can I say this?
Yeah, go for it.
When the founding fathers made their demands, they didn't ask for a vote or protest. They drew the tea in the river. Mm-hmm. They said, hey, if we're going to get your attention, it seems like this is what it takes.
Yeah, it was $1 million act of vandalism in 1773.
240 years ago, it still could work today. If we're going to really get demands instead of begging and protesting and marching, we got to start throwing some tea in the river.
So convert that to reality, Jesse. We've got 16 seconds. What do you mean?
We go to the Federal Reserve and start throwing some of that money into the river and start printing some money we could use.
Okay. I'm not sure how that would work, but because the Fed, it's all electronic now. But I get your point that and that's a really good question. And Jesse, thank you so much for the call. What is it that we should be doing if we're going to have a new Tea Party? What is it that we should be doing? What is it that, across the spectrum of, shall we call it, interest groups in America, what should all of us be doing? We'll be back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Nate just gave me the movement for a vision for Black lives. This is from the Movement for Black Lives. Policy demands for Black power, freedom, and justice. And this is a great summary of this is from policy.m4bl.org. And number one, end the war on black people. We demand an end to the war against black people. Since this country's inception, there have been named and unnamed wars on our communities. We demand an end to the criminalization, incarceration, and killing of our people. Number two, reparations. We demand reparations for past and continuing harms. The government, responsible corporations, and other institutions that have profited off the harm they have inflicted on black people, from colonialism to slavery through food and housing redlining, mass incarceration and surveillance, must repair the harm done. We've discussed this a number of times on this program. It's been a while since we've had that conversation. Divest, invest. We demand investments in the education, health, and safety of black people instead of investments in the criminalizing, caging, and harming of black people. We want investments in black communities determined by black communities and divestment from exploitative forces, including prisons, fossil fuels, police, surveillance, and exploitative corporations. Economic justice. We demand economic justice for all and a reconstruction of the economy to ensure black communities have collective ownership, not merely access. Community control. We demand a world where most those most impacted in our communities control the laws, control the institutions and the policies that are meant to serve us, from our schools to our local budgets, economies, police departments, and our land, while recognizing that the rights and histories of our indigenous family must also be respected. And now reach to Native Americans as well. And finally, political power. We demand independent black political power and black self-determination in all areas of society. We envision a remaking of the current U.S. political system in order to create a real democracy where black people and all marginalized people can effectively exercise full political power. And what are we getting from the Republican Party in response to this? Oh, let's make it harder for people to vote. Let's purge people from the voting lists. Let's, you know, and it just goes, the war on communities of color, on black people, continues in the Republican Party. It's pretty friggin' breathtaking. Marvin in Fort Myers, Florida. Hey, Marvin, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good.
Just want to make some quick points. The thing that you just got done talking about, I think the investment in education is the most realistic right now if we could do it today.
Yeah.
Secondly, the gentleman from Miami who just talked,
Jesse,
and the lady from, Jesse, and the lady from Seattle, I think they should maybe do a little research. Like you just got done saying, Democrats have always pushed for, you know, helping the poor, helping minorities. I can think of, number one, the Affordable Care Act. Come on, hello. You know, thirdly, what you just got done pointing out is the issue with, I lost my train of thought there for a second.
That's okay. While you're recovering it, I'll point out the Affordable Care Act. The largest part of the Affordable Care Act that would have benefited African Americans, and you know, keeping in mind the African American community encompasses the entire spectrum from very, very wealthy Americans to very poor Americans, but as a consequence of all these years of institutional racism, is more heavily concentrated in the middle class and lower middle class and poor area than is the broad white community, and therefore Medicaid, which is low, you know, free health care or low cost health care for people who are working at low-wage jobs. Medicaid was probably the largest health care benefit to African Americans in the United States. And what did the Republicans do? They challenged it all the way to the Supreme Court, which came out and said, no, if you've got a state that's controlled by Republicans, you don't have to expand Medicaid. And so millions of people across the United States for the last, 3, 4, 5 years have not had access to good health care because Obamacare was not extended. Back to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one last thing that I just want to say, the gentleman Jesse talking about going up to Federal Reserve or whatever and taking all the money out, that constitutes theft. And that's not the way that we go about doing it.
Yeah. I do think that his point about the Tea Party, though, you know, you got to do something to wake people up. I'm not advocating, violence or vandalism, and the Tea Party was an act of vandalism and arguably one of violence. They used force, or threatened force, but some sort of great shocking action. I think, we should brainstorm. Thank you, Marvin.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the True People's Media. Back with your calls right after this. In the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from American Holocaust by David Stannard, The Conquest of the New World. This is from the prologue. Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. It took a little longer, about the span of a single human generation, but what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshimas, and Hispaniola was only the beginning. Within no more than a handful of generations following their first encounters with the Europeans, the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere's native peoples had been exterminated. The pace and magnitude of their obliteration varied from place to place and from time to time, but for years, now historical demographers have been uncovering, in region upon region, post-Columbia depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% in Native American population has become a working rule of thumb. What this means is that, on average, for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, when the lands of the Americans teemed with numerous tens of millions of people, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over. To put this in a contemporary context, the ratio of native survivorship in the Americas following European contact was less than half of what the human survivorship ratio would be in the United States today if every single white person and every single black person died. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. That is why, as one historian aptly has said, far from the heroic and romantic heraldry that customarily is used to symbolize the European settlement of the Americas, the emblem most congruent with reality would be a pyramid of skulls. Scholars estimate the size of the post-Columbian Holocaust have climbed sharply in recent decades. Too often, however, academic discussions of this ghastly event have reduced the devastated indigenous people and their cultures to statistical calculations in reconciling demographic analyses. It was easy for this to happen. From the very beginning, merely taking the account of so mammoth a cataclysm seemed an impossible task, wrote one Spanish adventurer who arrived in the New World only 2 decades after Columbus's first landing, and who himself openly reveled in the torrent of native blood. There was neither, quote, paper nor time enough to tell all that the conquistadors did to ruin the Indians and rob them and destroy the land, end quote. As a result, the very effort to describe the disaster's overwhelming magnitude has tended to obliterate both the writer's and the reader's sense of its truly horrific human element. In an apparent effort to counteract this tendency, one writer, Tsvetsan Todorov, began his study of the events of 1492 and immediately thereafter with an epigraph from Diego de Landa's Relación de las Casas de Yucatán. Quote, the captain, Alonso Lopez de Avila, brother-in-law of the Adelmento de Montejo, captured during the war in Bacalan a young Indian woman of lovely and gracious appearance. She had promised her husband, fearful lest they should kill him in the war, not to have relations with any other man but him, and so no persuasion was sufficient to prevent her from taking her own life to avoid being defiled by another man. And because of this, they had her thrown to the dogs. Toborov then dedicates his book to the memory of a Mayan woman devoured by dogs. It is important to try and hold in mind an image of that woman and her brothers and sisters and the innumerable others who suffered similar fates as one reads Todorov's book, or this one, or any other work on this subject, just as it is essential, as one reads about the Jewish Holocaust or the horrors of the African slave trade, to keep in mind the treasure of a single life in order to avoid becoming emotionally anesthetized by the sheer force of such overwhelming human evil and destruction. There is, for example, the case of a small Indian boy whose name no one knows today, and whose unmarked skeletal remains are hopelessly intermingled with those of hundreds of anonymous others in a mass grave on the American plains, but a boy who once played on the banks of a quiet creek in eastern Colorado, until the morning in 1864, when the American soldiers came. Then, as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all of the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. Quote, there was one child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and drop his rifle and fire, but he missed the child. Another man came up and said, let me try the son of a bitch, I can hit him. He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. We must do what we can to recapture and try to understand in human terms what it was that was crushed, what it was that was butchered. It is not enough merely to acknowledge that much was lost. So close to total was the human incineration and carnage. And it continues. 34 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, defending America from the weapons of mass deception. S. Marie P. at Daily Decipher on Twitter has tweeted to me, Tom, there has been major policy legislation that has been passed for all of the following, quote, identity, end quote, groups. Number 1, immigrants. Number 2, LGBTQIA. And number 3, women. The Democratic Party, she says at the end, has not passed any national legislation to address the needs of black people, period. And then in her next tweet, she says, major policy legislation needs to address, number 1, police reform. I'm with you. And the Democrats, I believe, are working on this. Criminal justice reform, yes, there are efforts underway, but you're right. Things have not been passed. Number 3, employment and housing discrimination. That's actually getting worse under Ben Carson. Number 4, in other words, he's dialing back on the regulations to prevent it. Number 4, subsidies that incentivize non-blacks to set up businesses in majority poor black neighborhoods. That's interesting. I'd like to dig a little deeper into that. And number 5, black voter suppression. These are all things where, particularly black voter suppression, police reform, criminal justice reform, these are all things where if the Democrats controlled the House and Senate right now and had the White House, I think you would see some action. Keep in mind, when President Obama was president, during the entire 8 years of his presidency, he had 72 business days, 72 congressional days, during which he had a majority in the House and Senate, and he was in the White House. And he passed an enormous amount of legislation during that time. It was, well over 100 pieces of legislation that were substantial helpers to many, many people. And in fact, including the largest middle-class tax cut ever, saving Chrysler, saving GM, recovering 800,000 monthly jobs, education spending increased, student loan costs decreased, hate crime laws were strengthened. Well, that's, there you go. Affordable Care Act, CHIPS was expanded, the enforcement of child labor laws, Wall Street reform, credit card reform, predatory lending to soldiers was restricted, troops' time for stop loss are being paid, torture was stopped, VA spending was increased, women concerned about subs, equal pay for women. EPA strengthened, FDA powers broadened, 9/11 responders, health care, don't ask, don't tell, repealed. I mean, a lot of stuff got done during those 72 days, but there's still a lot to do. And the Republicans have been pushing voter suppression all across the United States very successfully ever since. Chris in Salem, Oregon. Hey, Chris, thanks for listening to X-Ray FM. What's on your mind?
Tom, in as much as we find value in, repeating the words of Paul Weyrich and Lee Atwater. What's his name? Yeah, Atwater. I do think that it has value in retelling this story, especially apropos of the first hour of basically paid trolls. I know your screener actually had never heard this story, so it was basically about that kid who was going on your forums and reciting talking points, then basically came back on the air and admitted he was a paid plant and went to basic training. And,
that was in 2004.
So could you tell that?
Sure. Real quickly, we had during the 2004 election when George Bush was running for re-election, we had a guy who was calling into the show all the time defending Bush, and he became very friendly with our community. We had a very active message board at the time. We've kind of subordinated all that now to Facebook and Twitter, but we had a real active message board at ThomHartmann.com. He got to know people. He told us what his real name was. It was really him, and he developed relationships with people, but he was constantly defending George Bush every single day, at least a half a dozen posts to our message board, and he tried to call into the program regularly. And when he finally, when George Bush won, about a month later, we got he logged onto the message board and posted a picture of himself in his Marine uniform and said, thanks a lot for helping me out. I was paid for every post I put on your message board by the Republicans. And now I'm going to go defend my country against the people who attacked us on 9/11. He was a true believer, but he was also a paid troll. And we all, several people got to know him quite well and liked him, even though he was a paid troll. And I talked about it on the air with him. and said, hey, keep us up to date. And he's like, I'm going off to Iraq. And we literally have never heard from him since. I fear that he was probably killed in action. But that's the story. It's a fascinating one, but it's an old one. Lowell in Salem, Oregon. Hey, Lowell, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I was wondering if you had seen a correlation between the countries we're invading and the Project for a New American Century list of, well, technically it says it's 8 countries to invade.
I would have to go back and look at that list. I know Iraq was at the top of their list in '98 when that was first published. Yeah. They were demanding that Clinton invade Iraq. But what are the other 7 countries? I'm assuming you have the list. I don't.
Yeah. So it was Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and Iran. And as we know, Bush got Iraq, and he added in Afghanistan. And then Obama, started bombing Pakistan, with drone strikes, and then got Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and Libya. So technically only Lebanon and Iran are left.
Right. Wow.
And I was wondering if, if it doesn't matter militarily who's in charge, because it seems like, these right-wing institutes put out these, these terrible plans, and then it doesn't seem to matter who's the president because they seem to get bombed anyway.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of that, Lowell, other than that, the neocon plan, which was, the neocons have been pushing this kind of stuff since the 60s when they started pushing the war in Vietnam. That all money, the large chunks of our money should go to our defense budget. Lowell, thanks for the call and thanks for pointing this all out. And that, and by coincidence, the defense budget people, the military contractors are the ones who are supporting the neocons. Whether it's funding their think tanks or funding the neoconservative political candidates for office, things like that. And so you have this cycle of money and war and money and war and money and war. Republicans who like to say that, the government can't produce stimulus, government programs don't help the economy, are also the same Republicans who very often will say, well, Franklin Roosevelt didn't get us out of the Great Depression. World War II got us out of the Great Depression. Right? I've literally had, Stephen Moore on this program said that. And, other Republicans have said that. Well, what was World War II other than a giant federal spending program? The problem is that war is the least efficient way to spend money to the benefit of your country. For every $1 billion we spend on bridges and roads and rail lines and high-speed internet infrastructure and things like that, for every $1 billion we spend on that, over the lifetime of those projects, we make $10, $20, $30, $50 billion in additional tax revenue from businesses and individuals using that infrastructure. So that's a real investment. But if we put $1 billion into bombs and then we drop those bombs on Iraq or Iran, what do we get back for that? Nothing. Those bombs are gone. That $1 billion has vanished. Now, some part of that $1 billion, of course, went to the defense contractors who made the bombs. And let's say that the $1 billion for the bombs, that the actual cost to make them was only $500 million, and the other half was kept by the defense contractors. So really only $500 million got destroyed when the bomb was dropped. The other $500 million went to salaries for all the people making the bombs and all that kind of stuff. So there was some small stimulative effect in the economy. Some people were getting wages or getting higher, bonuses and larger dividends on their stock, and thus spending money into the economy, which is how demand is stimulated. But the reality is that the worst, least effective, particularly long-term, least effective way to stimulate an economy is by doing war. It's why all the European countries are fighting, hey, we don't even want to go to 3% to satisfy, 3% of GDP devoted to defense to satisfy the demands of NATO. And, it's bad policy unless you're actually going to have to fight a friggin' war. And here in the United States, our federal budget, our defense budget is about half of our entire federal budget. I mean, it's absolutely massive. And it's not money well spent, frankly. But we've got these neoconservatives who think that, oh yeah, no, we've got to have war. It's all got to be war. Right. Anyhow, Andrew in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Andrew, thanks for listening to WGRN. What's up?
Hey, Tom, to further your point real quick there, if someone dropped a bomb in my impoverished neighborhood, it would destroy the whole neighborhood and kill a bunch of people, no economic activity. But if someone dropped a big balloon with cash equal to the value of the bomb, and that cash got, spread out on the streets, people would pick that money up, spend it, create jobs, and who knows what would happen to the neighborhood.
Well, and to that, Andrew, very quickly, this is what I was saying that George Bush should have done with Afghanistan from the get-go. Rather, the gross domestic product of Afghanistan when 9/11 happened, and Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11 other than hosting Osama bin Laden, but their GDP was only $2 billion. And I'm like, if you're going to fight a war with these guys, it's going to cost you $1 trillion. Why don't you instead take, say, $6 billion and just spread it across the Afghan economy as a redevelopment grant to help them build roads and build schools, and you will triple the income of every single person in Afghanistan. You will lift them out of poverty. You will cause them to reject this radical form of Wahhabism that had been imported from Saudi Arabia that bin Laden was spreading. And it's an investment. You build a solid world order. Anyhow, back to you. I think we've got about 10 seconds. I'm sorry.
Real quick. The next time someone asks what Democrats have done for black people, we have registered a heck of a lot more black people to vote than Republicans ever will or ever did. And if you don't use that vote, that's your choice. Yeah. Well,
I would say that that has been largely led by African Americans across the country, those efforts. But just the fact that the Democratic Party welcomes black registration and the Republican Party is aggressively trying to suppress the black vote should tell you everything. Andrew, thank you for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And I want to make it clear, I'm not here as some shill for the Democratic Party. I believe that if progressives, people of color, people of goodwill can take it over, it can be a force for good. And welcome back. And let's see here, that's Van in Lewis Center, Ohio. Hey, Van, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. First of all, I feel like that guy was being condescending at the end, like, throw us a piece of
Yeah, exactly.
whatever.
It was the same kind of remark that I made at the end of the show yesterday, and I was catching the tin ear of that. Thank you, Van.
Well, I watched that, and I don't think that was you did get thrown off, and I don't know if that guy was a troll or not, but what I do know is that you're going to get a lot of calls from people like him, and I feel the same way about a lot of things, but I know there's nowhere else I can go but the Democratic Party, and they have done a lot. But Lynn, I listened to her, and she was talking about how they don't come out in the public realm to like defend us or support us, and like they will. This is what I always think is that I like Maxine Waters. Chuck Schumer, he went out there and he said something like she shouldn't have did that or whatever, and Nancy Pelosi finally came out and said she supported her. But it's like when we don't have that support and we feel it. I promise you, when my people watch TV and we hear the Democrats when they go down to the border and they fight for the families down there, when they go to the airports and they fight for Muslims, when they talk about the LGBT, I can't remember.
The gay community, yeah.
More to it. Yeah. And when they're fighting for all these groups, I promise you, we're sitting at home, and we're saying, well, why don't they ever come out and fight for us when there's, all these police killings? Why aren't they fighting for us when they know that there's, our young men are being incarcerated and women? Why aren't they showing some kind of support, some kind of fierce support like they do for these other groups? So this is what we see all the time, is that they don't have our back, that they feel like they're identified as the African American Party, and they, in the majority of the time, they're running from it. And so we're sitting here and we're going to vote Democrat, and we're going to go out there and campaign, but they're not. They don't have our. They might be trying to fight for us in their own little way, passing bills and stuff like this to talk, but they're not out there in the public realm like they are for all these other groups. Yeah. And when push comes, when all comes down to it, this is the way we feel. When the Muslims, they're no longer denigrated. When the families are back together, the Hispanics, when the gay community got everything they want, we're still fighting. Mm-hmm. We're still doing what we got to do because we're still who we are.
Yeah.
And so we're thinking everybody else got everything they want, and we have been fighting forever, and we're going to continue to fight till,
so it's almost
recognize.
It's almost like they're telling black people go to the back of the line.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. We'll fight for everybody else, but nobody is specifically fighting for us.
I get it.
Yeah, that's where I feel.
Great call, Van. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for the information.
Thank you.
It's good talking with you.
Okay.
I am learning. Thank you. We'll be back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Welcome back. Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. On the line with us is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News based out of the UN in New York, Luke Vargas. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. Hey, Luke, what's going on in the world today?
Hey, Tom. Kind of busy, hectic day if you pick up the international headlines, at least. There's a lot I've been tracking. One thing I think is a little bit interesting, we don't need to dwell on it too long, but the Chinese government has a deadline set for tomorrow for U.S. airlines to officially recognize Taiwan as part of China. This has been something that American Airlines itself, but just U.S. airlines writ large, have sort of staked out a little bit of a political statement on through the years. Like some hotel chains before them, if you want to go to, let's say, Taipei, which is the capital of the island of Taiwan, Republic of Japan, or of China, they say, hey, we're going to list that as TW, part of essentially implying this is an independent country. China, though, last year amended its policies and said, look, if international corporations are upsetting the Chinese public in any way, we can strip their ability to operate in China. And one way in which China has actually tried to exercise this is saying, hey, you have until tomorrow, the 25th, to change that and to list Taiwan as part of China, CN, with the little country code. And these airlines had asked, I guess Delta, United and American had asked for delays on this, and there has been an ongoing attempt by the White House to try and get China to back down. But that hasn't happened. And so the word is that in the next few hours this is going to switch over, and the recognition is going to go to Taiwan being part of mainland China. And it's part of a broad effort by the Chinese government to really further diplomatically isolate Taiwan. There aren't very many major countries in the world these days that recognize the independence of Taiwan, but the few that still remain, China has been targeting, not necessarily through threats, but more through incentives. Going to country, this is just a good story in The Economist last week, a country like Paraguay, which still recognizes Taiwan, China's going there and saying, hey, we're going to give you X, Y, and Z, a lot more than Taiwan could ever offer up. And reading between the lines, the message is pretty clear. So this is a closing of a chapter where companies can sort of stake out a political statement on the Taiwan issue. They'll be paying a price if they want to keep doing that.
It looks to me like it's the Hong Kong playbook, incremental steps. They haven't fully absorbed Hong Kong's political system, but it's 90% there right now.
Indeed, as one person described it, it's death by 1,000 cuts for Taiwan. You don't do this all at once, but the net effect is.
But at some point, the Chinese army is going to show up there, and we're going to have to make some serious decisions. And at that point, we may have lost the ability to say, "But wait a minute, that's a sovereign country."
Sure. I think of all times for China to flip this in and test U.S. resolve to, really go the distance on behalf of Taiwan at a time when we're trying to do so many other things on the trade war. I think this is a relatively convenient time for Beijing to make this move and not get a huge direct response from Washington. Shifting gears, I have noted that North Korea, according to satellite imagery, has begun to dismantle one of its missile testing facilities in a sort of a development facility. This does appear to be what we would call a confidence-building measure, a sign that, 5-6 weeks after this meeting in Singapore, that something is happening, toward the goals that were sort of put on paper there. At the same time, I would hesitate, if any, Trump backers are going to come out here and say this is proof the threat is gone. This is a engine development facility and was very, very useful to North Korea when they were still working on what their long-range missiles would look like. Well, last year they said they were happy with their design and they moved out of the testing phase and into manufacturing. And so the missiles that were honed at this facility have been finalized. There's almost a reduced need, if not no need, for this facility to exist anymore. And further, this was a liquid fuel engine facility, and we don't need to get into the details, but old school rockets need to be mounted on a permanent firing base and gassed up right there on the spot. Now they're using solid fuel, and you don't need these permanent sites. And most of North Korea's more recent missile tests have been carried out on mobile launch pads or sort of on the go, on the fly around the country. No need to have these bulky, permanent sites anymore. So it's a good thing. But again, how much does this reduce the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear missile program? I think to claim that it is some silver bullet would be to, a big exaggeration, but that won't stop anyone. I have to say, I've been on the radio a lot with various hosts to say, why isn't the mainstream media giving credit for them returning the remains of Korean soldiers? And I kept saying, hey, they haven't done this yet. Anybody saying this is all going to happen on some very certain timeline is mistaken. This is going to be a long process. And if this dismantlement continues, I think it's only just one of many steps that need to occur.
Yeah. What else is up?
Finally, I would throw in, we've had sort of an interesting week along the Israeli-Syrian border. There's some headlines today that Israel shot down a Syrian jet that may have strayed into Israeli territory. Obviously, we had the evacuation of Syrian white helmets, these medics, volunteer medics in the country who I guess were sort of being encroached upon by the Assad army, and that caught the attention of Western leaders who orchestrated sort of an evacuation of these medics and their families over the weekend through Israel and then onward to Jordan, where they'll be resettled. The major point, though, pulling back, is that it appears we have a deal now between the U.S., Israel, and Russia to basically allow the Syrian government to recapture this border area in southwest Syria. The only real demand going back the other way is that Iranian-backed troops are going to be required to be no closer than 50 miles from the Israeli border. The takeaway here, I think, is that the U.S., realizing it doesn't really have much leverage in Syria anymore, it's the rebel groups that once used to back in that part of the country are never going to make real territorial gains. And so we're saying, look, we don't have any existing interests there, only to guard Israel's security. And so that is the concession that we have agreed to. Look, Russia's got to enforce if they can do that. And that's a very good question, mandating that these Iranian groups don't encroach too much on the Golan Heights. So again, I think
Israel's okay with this?
Closing a chapter of America's role in this Syrian conflict.
And Israel's okay with this?
Israel specifically asked for this and negotiated this deal with the Russians the week before the U.S.-Russia summit in Helsinki. And we're told this is something that Netanyahu and Putin worked out, and then that Putin and Trump sort of agreed to in Helsinki. So this is the first big thing to come out of that summit.
Fascinating. Okay, Luke Vargas with Talk Media News. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Tom. Talk to you soon.
Fascinating stuff. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls and your thoughts and my thoughts on all of the above. I got to tell you about a piece of legislation that Rick Nolan and Mike Gallagher, Gallagher's a Republican, have just introduced into Congress. We'll pick that up and pick up your calls, too, on the other side of the news here. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, thomsbeets.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom. And welcome back to our Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading From Devil's Bargain by Joshua Green, the subtitle Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. This is from the afterword, the very last chapter. It's titled Kali Yuga, which in Hinduism is when the earth goes into a phase of destruction. In the shell-shocked aftermath of the election, President Obama, looking shaken, appeared in the White House Rose Garden to deliver public remarks intended to project a sense of calm. A sense, really, that the basic stability of our country remained intact. Sun is up, Obama said. I know everybody had a long night. I did as well. Had a chance to talk to President-elect Trump last night, about 3:30 in the morning, I think it was, to congratulate him on winning the election. End of quote. The next day, when the two men appeared together in the Oval Office, it felt as if the world had slipped through the looking glass. Trump quickly named Bannon his chief White House strategist. Republicans controlled every branch of government. With Trump's ability to defy every political norm, anything seemed possible. Who could argue otherwise after what had just transpired? And yet, within days of his inauguration, Trump's White House was plunged into chaos and scandal from which it has not recovered and may never. Bannon, the imaginative reconceiver of U.S. politics, hung streams of paper listing Trump's promises from the walls of his West Wing office. His strategy, as always, was to launch furious attacks, this time to, quote, shock the system, end quote, and rapidly reorient the federal government in a more nationalist direction. He called this, with what I took to be intentional irony, a shock and awe approach to asserting Trump's power. But Trump's flurry of activity quickly ran into problems. There was his executive order, sprung a week after his inauguration, banning immigrants from 7 majority Muslim countries, which set off nationwide protests and was blocked by the courts. His firing 2 weeks later of National Security Director Michael Flynn for contacts with the Russians. The collapse of his first major legislative initiative, a bill to repeal Obamacare. His firing of FBI Director James Comey. And the swift descent of the West Wing into a viper's nest of backstabbing and leaks. This quick turn toward a crack-up was hardly unforeseeable or even altogether surprising, but it contrasted sharply with the success of a candidate who had dominated his opponents, shaped news coverage, and shown himself to be all but impervious to the forces that overwhelm other politicians. Bannon, whose wild gambits in the campaign had invariably paid off, seemed to run out of magic tricks when Hillary Clinton was no longer a target. The government wasn't as malleable to Trump and Bannon's aggressions as the Republican Party and the cable news channels had been. And they found themselves consistently thwarted and undermined by the courts, by right-wing hardliners in Congress, by their own inexperience and Trump's errant tweets, and by the bureaucracy they were now overseeing. The crises these failures precipitated in the White House cost Bannon much of his influence and soon threatened Trump's presidency. While it's still early in his term, the possibilities that Trump's most ardent supporters once imagined for his presidency already seem to be mostly foreclosed. I think there are 3 main reasons why Trump's administration has so quickly fallen into disorder and confusion. Number 1, Trump thought being president was about asserting dominance. Just after he'd locked up the GOP nominations, Trump said something to me that crystallized his view of politics and explains, to my mind, much of his subsequent difficulties. Quote, I deal with people that are very extraordinarily talented people, he told me. I deal with Steve Wynn. I deal with Carl Icahn. I deal with killers that blow these politicians away. It's not even the same category. This, he meant politics, This is a category that's like 19 levels lower. You understand what I'm saying? Brilliant killers. Trump was equating politics with business and the presidency with the job of being a big shot CEO, a killer. He filled the upper ranks of his administration with people of a similar mindset. Gary Cohn, Wilbur Ross, Steve Bannon, aggressive, domineering men accustomed to getting their way by dint of their position. None had government experience, nor did many others in the West Wing. So none anticipated the problems this approach to governing would cause. Trump's self-conception as the all-powerful apprentice boss blinded him to a fundamental truth of the modern presidency, that the president needs Congress more than the Congress needs the president. Trump's domineering instinct served him poorly, since most members of Congress are secure in their jobs and accountable mainly to their own constituents. And it backfired disastrously when Trump fired Comey after he refused to submit to a pledge of loyalty to his boss. Number two, Trump ran against the Republican Party, Wall Street, and Paul Ryan, but then took up their agenda. Populists often struggle to govern, but Trump scarcely attempted to lead the populist revolution that he promised. In May, he told me he would transform the Republican Party into a workers' party. But while he kept voicing populist shibboleths, the legislative agenda he took up was the standard conservative fare pushed by Paul Ryan. During the GOP primary, Trump has shrewdly sensed its weak point, Ryan's desire to finance tax cuts for the rich by cutting programs like Social Security and Medicaid, harmed the party's white blue-collar base. Trump told me he'd made this point to Ryan directly. He said, quote, "There's no way a Republican is going to beat a Democrat when the Republican is saying we're going to cut your Social Security, and the Democrat is saying we're going to keep it and give you more." The book is Devil's Bargain by Joshua Green, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storm of the Presidency.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. 18.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Donald Trump just tweeted, just a few hours ago. "I'm very concerned that Russia will be fighting very hard to have an impact on the upcoming election." Really? Did you discuss this with Mr. Putin in Helsinki? It's President Putin? "I'm very concerned that Russia will be fighting very hard to have an impact on the upcoming election." And then he continues, "Based on the fact that no president has been tougher on Russia than me, they will be pushing very hard for the Democrats. They definitely don't want Trump!" Exclamation mark. Right. So this is just like, in my opinion, this is just like I pointed out yesterday, I believe it was, that Trump has tweeted that the Fed shouldn't be raising interest rates right now, and that it'll harm our economy. And when I retweeted that, I retweeted it with a comment that, hey, Trump knows the economy's going to tank. He is pre-blaming it on the Fed. Well, here Trump knows that the Republicans are going to lose, the Democrats are going to win big in the election in 2018. Knock wood, and he's pre-blaming the Russians. Really? That's all you got, Donnie? Spanky? Amazing. Steve in Chicago. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to make a couple of points. I was actually shocked to find that the stand your ground law in states like Texas is sort of a backup to existing law, such that if it didn't exist, this gentleman who would probably be indicted would stand a good chance of getting off nonetheless because of existing law.
Yeah.
This is just the sort of...
Well, and a lot of it depends on the prosecutors and the judges, and the Federalist Society and other corporate shill organizations have been really aggressive at getting hard right judges, Brett Kavanaugh hard right judges appointed to lifetime appointments on the federal bench. They're cranking as many as they can. They're running dozens of them through every month.
Right.
After blocking Obama for 5 years on this.
Right, because unfortunately the circumstances of this particular case sort of muddy the waters, and that understand your ground. You are not obligated to run away, despite the fact that you have the opportunity to do so. So the fact that this one individual was on the ground after being pushed to the ground by another individual, you then can argue, well, I'm on the ground, I can't run. My only option is to pull out a gun and shoot someone. That's the scary part of this, that even without stand your ground laws, there's a way out for people like this. And that's the thing people need to recognize.
Well, I think probably what would have happened is it would have been pled down to something like justifiable manslaughter, and the justifiable part would be feared for your life. But I think that there would still be charges. It's maybe in Texas they could have gotten out of it, but that's pretty amazing. Steve, thanks for the call and thanks for pointing that out. Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Good.
Yeah. When it comes to election times, when you was talking about, the American black people and what happens, we get marginalized to 3/5 of a person again, because that that came in during the election times back in colonial or the early part of this country's making.
Right.
And so because of the South, there was more slaves than there were white people in the South. So they had to do something about that when it came to elections. So they made us 3/5 of a person.
Right.
And it seems like every time when it comes to election time, when it comes to getting our issues or what we need or what we want, we seem to get, they say, they promise us little and give us hardly nothing. And so to me, that's like being marginalized again to that 3/5 of a person. They just want your vote to get in and to get what they want, and then we're forgotten about. And what we need is people. We need candidates who will be for the people and will stand for rights that we want, like free education, free health care, pay student athletes. I mean, truly democratize capitalism with democratic issues, just like they want to privatize. Now, when you come into privatization, that means you going over into the commons and stuff, and you want to democratize. You want to capitalize democracy, but this is supposed to be a democracy first, because without a democracy, you wouldn't have a capitalism.
Yeah, all excellent points, Maine, and I'm hearing this loud and clear from our African American listeners and viewers that many of you are feeling that the Democratic Party even has, aggressively worked for the benefit of gay people, of immigrants, of Hispanics, of Muslims, and has not as aggressively worked on behalf of African Americans. I get that. I didn't actually get that yesterday, and I'm getting that today. Man, thank you for the call, and thanks for participating in the enlightenment of Thom Hartmann. Michael in southwestern Michigan. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hey.
You always say I'm still out here in my woods, right, trying to get the house rebuilt. You said that when I live in the woods, I become a part of it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm standing on the tree line so I can get a good signal looking over my farmer's square mile of crops. First of all, I joined the Democratic Party, and I'm running for precinct delegate.
Great.
At your behest. And what I want to say is we fail. We're asking the wrong question because we don't have the language. You can't ask what the Democrats have done for a particular group like my group, which were brought here against their will on slave ships. I can explain to you who I am without using a color, a demographic, or a label. Mm-hmm. What you have to realize is that poor people versus the 10%, it's more of us than them. And when we frame things that way, you have to understand poor people and people like my group, my ancestors, we suffer from PTSD. And in many cases, problems with adult ADHD. And living in these woods, I'm having to be like a hunter. I hunt for everything. And when you talk, you may be talking to hunters who are trying to survive in a farmer's world, right?
Mm-hmm. To use the ADD metaphor, yeah.
Exactly. And what happens is people like Maxine Waters and my friend here locally, they're considered brash or outspoken or hostile. And that's even when women who may be hunting or you realize, right, that they're showing you what we admire in men. for the most part. So let's not make that mistake. But what I want to say is, when I joined the party because I want to change the language to a language of victory. Lee Atwater was no genius, but he knew the importance of language.
Yeah.
Right? And what I want this party to do is, rather than focus with language that talks about how many Detroit voters were thrown off, let's talk about the voting deadlines in every state. Rather than beat people with a cudgel, saying, you don't vote enough, you don't vote enough. Wrong. You turn us off with that. Tell us what deadlines are coming up.
Yeah, October 10th is the registration deadline. Be sure you get out there before then. That's what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm saying, and the only reason I found out was because I got a notice with my summer tax bill. If you don't receive one of those, you won't know.
Wow.
So it becomes the haves against the have-nots. Are you seeing what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Clearly.
So what I want the Democrats to do is to learn how to win locally. They can't do that, and they try to win nationally. Explain to people that your local elected officials, some are appointed to the Electoral College. Okay? If you don't like the results in 2 elections, change the Electoral College by knowing your voting deadlines. Be aggressive. We're hunters.
There you go. Okay, Michael, well said and spot on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the call, and thanks for sharing your story with us. 15 minutes. We've got a lot of work to do in this country. 15 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I got to share with you Elizabeth Holtzman's resignation letter to Christian Nielsen. We'll do that after the break. It's brilliant. And let's see, whoops. Jenny in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Jenny, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV.
Yeah, Tom, I'm looking for...
Or Jerry, I'm sorry. Jerry.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Looking for your opinion. It seems as though the Trump supporters are unshakable. It doesn't matter what he does.
That's not true.
We're heading for...
That's not true. What has happened, it seems that way because that's how the media is reporting it, and they love doing these stories about here's the Trump supporting soybean farmer who's being wiped out by the tariffs, but he still loves Trump. The fact of the matter is that Trump, his support in the Republican Party right now is 88%, which sounds spectacular, until you notice that the number of people who self-identify as Republicans has dropped by millions in the last 2 years. I mean, lots and lots and lots of people who once proudly said, I'm a Republican and I voted for Donald Trump, are now saying, I'm not a Republican and I don't want to have anything to do with Trump. And so as the pool, and they're no longer being surveyed as Republicans. So what's happened is the pool of Republican voters has shrunk down to basically the Fox News base, which is about 20% of Americans who regularly are getting their news from Fox News or right-wing hate radio. And that's it. I mean, that's Trump's base. It's about 1/5 of the American electorate, and the majority of them, the vast majority of them, simply, the white people. Back to you, Jerry.
Well, you don't hear that in the media, that's for sure.
Yeah, but it's true.
So we're a lot of the economists say we're heading for this recession.
Yeah,
says we're overdue for it. If we can, if I guess the media can prove or at least direct that this has been caused by change in trade policies by Trump, would that shake the rest of the base? So just looking for your opinion, would a recession hurt?
I doubt it because, if Trump was doing the tariff thing right, I would be fully supportive of it. We need protective tariffs. We need a VAT tax. I mean, there's some simple structural stuff that China has, that Germany has, that France has, the UK has, that we don't have, that protects domestic manufacturing. And there's a reason why all those countries do that. South Korea does it. Taiwan does it. Pick your country that has a strong manufacturing sector. It is in large part because of domestic content requirements, government purchasing requirements, VAT taxes, and tariffs. And we all have tariffs, by the way. It's just that everybody has lowered them dramatically, but we've lowered them down to an average of around 1.2%. Germany's only lowered them to an average of around 10%. So if he was doing this through a legislative process that would actually produce long-term permanent changes in our trade relationships, then American manufacturers would be saying, hey, let's build a factory. But because he's doing this by executive order citing national security, it will evaporate the day he leaves office. And no manufacturer is going to invest $200 million in a new factory based on Donald Trump's word. So that's the problem I've got with it, Jerry. Back to you.
So I guess you're saying that even a recession.
Yeah, I think his base would, you know, much like me. I mean, we all realize that it's lousy trade policy that has taken away good American jobs in part, and that, you know, transitioning to a good trade policy is going to be a fairly long and painful process, because getting into this mess, you know, it really started with Nixon's opening to China, but it really got rolling under Reagan. And you know, it's been going on for 30, 40 years. So getting back out of it is going to be painful and difficult. And I think Trump supporters who believe he's doing the right thing for the right reasons are willing to hang in. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, thomsbeets.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Bob in Burnside, Kentucky. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind?
Yes, sir. I wanted to. I'm a first-time caller. I have a telephone.
Thank you, Bob.
So this is. You wrote a book about the fall of 2016, and I read the book, and I kept looking at the economics and everything, and it seemed like it didn't quite happen. And about the end of.
Bob, you still there?
No.
Bob, your phone is turning into total mush here.
Oh, well, I'm trying to.
Can you stand by a window or whatever it takes?
Okay. Well, anyway, there was this thing called the special draw rights, and could I get you to talk about that?
Special draw rights?
Yes, sir.
I don't know about special draw rights.
I know nobody ever talks about it. I heard about it a couple of years ago with on RT. I think it was.
Well, what is special draw rights?
Yes, sir. And it's about a bunch of money that the governments were able to get a hold of, and they hadn't gotten a hold of it since World War II. It's like a very special slush fund of some sort of lots of money.
Yeah.
And anyway.
Bob, I don't know about this, and I don't know that it's not some, wild internet fantasy, or it might be some real serious thing. Let me do a little research and dig into it. Well, thank you for the call. Say what?
Okay, I think that guy on RT, that economics guy.
I don't know, but I'll look it up. Bob, thank you for the call. It's interesting stuff. Michael in New Haven, Connecticut. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind?
Good afternoon. Real quick, see, for me, as African American, I go by like Dr. King said. He never endorsed either party. Malcolm X called them Dixiecrats, and you still have Dixiecrats, which y'all call blue dog and yellow dogs, in the Democratic Party. See, for me, the Republicans do the bank job, the Democrats drive the getaway car. I believe what Lonnie Guinier said. We need proportional representation. She tried to put this on the table and got in trouble. I've been studying proportional representation. Under proportional representation, you'd have like a multi-party system. There'd be no gerrymandering. What's your take on proportional representation?
I think proportional representation is the answer to our problems. James Madison in Federalist Number 10 identified the problem. You know, with first past the post, winner take all types of representation and voting, you can only have two political parties. And you can legally have more than two, but what will happen is that, you know, they end up screwing up the system. And, you know, he didn't know the solution. And it wasn't until the 1850s, late 1850s, that John Stuart Mill published his book, Laying Out Proportional Representation. And at that time, there was only a half a dozen democratic republics around the world. After the Civil War, a lot of them picked up democracy, particularly in Europe. And they picked up Mill's idea of proportional representation that you're talking about here, where if your party gets 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats in Parliament. You get 22% of the vote, you get 22% of the seats. You get 1% of the vote, you get 1% of the seats. And so everybody has an opportunity to be represented. That's what we're talking about, right, Michael?
Right, because under that type of system, nobody loses. Again, there's no gerrymandering.
Yeah.
If you take a look now, both parties are controlled by the corporate plutocracy. They're both controlled. The birds
Well,
are singing.
to some extent, there are some Republicans who are, I think, wholly owned subsidiaries of either the NRA or Koch Industries, and there are some Democrats who are wholly owned subsidiaries of banks and insurance companies. But I don't, but I don't know in the Republican Party of anybody who is actually independent of large outside forces and totally there for the people. I don't know. I can't identify a single Republican that I would say that's true of. I can identify close to 100 Democrats that I know that's true of because they're members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Right, but you got some Dixiecrats in it, like Malcolm said.
Yeah, no, but that's changing, and it's changing fast.
But if you have, like, you remember Lonnie Guinell when she brought it up on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Lonnie Guinell brought it up?
Proportional representation. Yeah, well, that's the problem is that proportional representation would, you know, there is a way to get there that would require a majority, a supermajority of the states, or there is a way to get there which is amending the Constitution. But proportional representation pretty much would have to be written into the Constitution. And amending the Constitution is a huge, heavy lift. We can, you know, the fairvote.org people have ranked choice voting. They're promoting that all across the United States, and that's a really important one that would actually work really well. You know,
I know about the fair vote just got proportionation for Port Chester. They went to court.
Yeah, yeah.
See, we wouldn't be arguing. The more voices you have, the better. We're a laughing stock of countries, a two-party system.
Yeah, yeah.
And look how private access is closed. They want me. I'm unaffiliated. They said, well, you want to vote, switch over. I'm not switching over for what?
Yeah.
Make it open primaries.
Yeah, no, I get it. There's two things that need to happen simultaneously, and they are actually just very slowly, although the first is happening more rapidly than the latter, and that is, number one, that the Democratic Party needs to get back to its foundations, back to FDR and LBJ, back to the idea of being a fully inclusive party that is here for the bottom 90% of Americans, not the top 10% of Americans, which is what the Democratic Party has been doing for some time, or some parts of the Democratic Party has been doing for some time. And number two, you know, we need to do what fairvote.org is talking about and go to, if not proportional representation, at least ranked choice voting, or, you know, ranked choice voting, like Australia has done, like New Zealand has done, because they had the same problem we had. Michael, well said. Thank you so much for the call. I appreciate it. Good and important stuff. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with more of your calls in the news of the day right after this. For the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from a book written by my old friend, Dennis Weaver. He has passed away. I wrote the foreword to this book, just FYI. It's called All the World's a Stage, and it's Dennis's autobiography. Dennis Weaver, Chester and Gunsmoke, you know, all that kind of stuff. He's talking about early in the Depression. This is from page 17. It's just kind of telling his early life. Early in the Depression, it became clear that people had to... He's talking about the 1930s, right? When he was a young boy. Early in the Depression, it became clear that people had to come together and support each other, or many would just not survive. Not being cooperative and neighborly was not an option. If our neighbors were in trouble, we would not think twice about helping them. We just did it. I remember a family named Hardy bought the 10 acres next to our farm. There was nothing on that land except woods. The men in the surrounding area got together on weekends to cut down the trees and made logs to build a house, a real log raising. Within 6 or 7 weekends, they built a log home for the Hardy family to live in and a shed for their cows. Children had lots of fun. We played games and jumped from stump to stump like leaping frogs while the men sawed logs and hammered nails. Ladies brought covered dishes of food like potato salad, baked beans, and Jell-O, and we had a picnic at lunchtime. It was a community thing, a gathering of friends, and to this day, I still carry the feeling with me. In those times and moments, despite the Depression, we thought we had the best of life, and in a way we really did. Life was simpler. We knew how good it felt to be neighborly, to share our lives with each other. The national economy was shredded due to the crash of 1929, but in our area, including parts of Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, the problem was exacerbated by what was known as the Great Dust Bowl. Continuing droughts had dried up the earth, and the fierce winds picked up the defenseless soil and made huge clouds of thick, swirling dust. Visibility often shrunk to a few yards. Most skilled and determined farmers were humbled before its wrath. The nutritious topsoil was all blown away, and agriculture came to a screeching halt. At the time, I didn't understand it, but it's crystal clear to me now that our economy and our environment are interdependent. When the environment at that time was destroyed and the farmers could no longer farm, they weren't the only ones who suffered. The economic disaster for the farmers spread like a raging virus to carpenters, plumbers, shop owners, and even bankers. Okies by the thousand piled whatever possessions they could salvage into cars, trucks, any jalopy that would run, and headed for California, which Dust Bowl victims considered to be the land of milk and honey. Perhaps the only one who profited from the Dust Bowl was John Steinbeck when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Because of the Dust Bowl, our farm was not financially successful. It certainly helped to feed the family, but the extra income my folks had hoped it would generate did not materialize. Mom, always trying to find a way out, heard from neighbors who had fled the Dust Bowl and our devastated economy earlier that the strawberry picking was good in Oregon. There was money to be made just for the picking. So we gave up on the farm and moved back to my birthplace in Joplin, 619 Brownell, to get ready for the trek west. Furthest west I'd ever been was Blackwell, Oklahoma. Would I see a real live cowboy? I wondered. What would Oregon be like? I might even see the Pacific Ocean. Our budget for the trip was minimal at best. Like the pioneers who crossed the Great Plains 100 years earlier, we were obliged to carry our own supplies because motels and restaurants were out of the question. Unlike those earlier settlers, the horses that carried us were not hitched to a wagon, but were under the hood of a 1928 DeSoto. Our plan was simple. Mom, Howard, Mary Ann, 2 years old by this time, Jerry, Denzel, Bell, and I would go to Oregon and pick strawberries and do what other jobs we could get. We would save our earnings and come back to Joplin in time for Howard and me to go back to school. Dad would stay behind, keep his job at the Empire District, and serve as a safety net for us. In case we broke down or got stranded, he could bail us out. Denzel was a carpenter by trade. He put his skills to good use. He built a cupboard on the back of Old Betsy, our DeSoto, where we could store an ample supply of canned goods and food staples. By releasing a fastener, the backside of the cupboard opened up and a leg swung down to support it, and lo and behold, we had a table on which to prepare the food and off of which we could eat. We jammed the storeroom with supplies, gave Old Betsy a final mechanical check, said our farewells, and headed west for the wild blue yonder. Although she never hinted at it, I'm sure Mom must have had a few qualms and trepidations. For me, it was just the beginning of what I imagined to be a great adventure. We started out for Oregon in the late spring of 1934. In those days, there were no 4-lane interstates, just 2-lane roads that were often in need of repair and full of detours. Our top speed was 40 miles an hour, so driving to Oregon was no walk in the park. Not long after crossing into Colorado from Kansas, we could see on the horizon what looked like a triangular cloud. It was strange because, like the other clouds moved, this one didn't budge. We used it as a guiding star for more than 2 hours before we realized it wasn't a cloud at all. It was the snow-capped top of Pikes Peak. As we drove deeper and deeper into the Rocky Mountains, I was moved more and more by their sheer beauty and breathtaking grandeur. It was awesome. I loved the majestic granite mountains, the tall pines, the quaking aspens, the crisp, dry air. It was all very magical to me. I guess I'm back in Colorado today because I was so impressed with it as a child. I was not only impressed by the beauty, but by what it had to offer. This was the first time I'd ever seen a real live working cowboy, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a real deer. We were driving over Wolf Creek Pass at dusk, coming around a bend, and there, right in front of us, was this wild deer running down the road in and out of the shadows. The book, All the World's a Stage, Dennis Weaver's autobiography. The foreword by Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Helping you in the water cooler wars, Thom Hartmann here with you. Liz Holtzman was a member of Congress for years and years from representing New York State, and in Brooklyn. And she, up until last week, was a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council. And she wrote a letter, July 16th, to Kirstjen Nielsen, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And I just want to quote pieces of the letter to you. There was a time that the U.S. welcomed refugees, she says. Well, actually, let me start at the beginning. As an author of the Refugee Act of 1980, along with Senator Ted Kennedy, I believe the treatment of refugees by you and President Trump violates that law and our treaty obligations to refugees. There was a time that the U.S. welcomed refugees. We readily accepted and absorbed more than 600,000 from Cuba, 750,000 refugees from Vietnam, and more than 100,000 Jews from the Soviet Union. Considering that history, the thought that the U.S. government is afraid today of 2,000 children and their parents is both laughable and appalling. Under your administration, she's talking to Kirstjen Nielsen, the Secretary of Homeland Security, cabinet official. Under your administration and that of Donald Trump's, DHS has been transformed into an agency that is making war on immigrants and refugees. The ethnically and religiously motivated travel ban, the refusal to provide relief to the Dreamers, and the new mass deportation program that does not prioritize the removal of undocumented aliens with serious criminal records, thereby harming American citizen children and spouses by removing a parent and breadwinner from the family and hurting our country by removing productive people who've been living here for decades. Your policies are malign and ultimately self-destructive. The final straw for me has been the separation of children from their parents at the southern border. This is child kidnapping, plain and simple. Seizing children from their parents is a violation of the constitutional rights of both, and that's bad enough, mentally harmful to the children and infinitely painful to both the parents and the children. But do so without creating proper records to enable family reunification shows utter depravity on the part of the government officials involved. Although it is I who am resigning in protest against these policies, Elizabeth Holtzman says to Kirstjen Nielsen, it is you who should be tendering your resignation instead. Wham! Daily Kos is reporting that a new Republican grassroots effort has sprung up to force seniors to pay more for prescription drugs. Seriously, it's a grassroots effort by Republicans all across the country to change the Medicare laws so that discounts, if you fall into the donut hole, when you're in that, if you've spent more than about $2,000 but not yet $5,000 on drugs for the year, the drug companies have to give you a discount. And this grassroots Republican group wants to do away with those discounts and, hey, more profits for the drug companies. Turns out the grassroots Republican group is probably Big Pharma. Michael in Los Angeles. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. Real quick, I just want to say, real quick, I wasn't going to ask you about terrorists, but I've been hearing all these phone calls from a lot of the black listeners calling in about the Democratic Party, and I have to sound off on it. I'm a young African-American man myself, and I'm very active in my local Democratic Party here in Southern California, and I'm all around it. I'm going to tell you right now, I went to the California State Democratic Convention a couple months ago here in San Diego, and I was standing out there on the floor with the delegates and a lot of the other members of the party. I mean, there were thousands of people there, and I promise you, you look behind you, you can count the black people in there on one hand. I mean, it's just one of these things where I hear a lot of us complain about the Democratic Party, yet I see very, very few of us actually participating to make that change within the Democratic Party. I personally don't know what a lot of these people are talking about. I mean, I get it, but at the end of the day, me being a black man, and I've been voting Democratic my whole life, I'm not a member of the Democratic Party. I don't vote Democratic because I'm black or because somebody makes me feel obligated to or because I feel like they're trying to earn, or I feel like they deserve my vote, or they're trying to earn my vote. I vote Democratic because I agree with the platform of the party, which is egalitarian. And it's not, to me, it's not about my black agenda. It's about the United States of America. It's about all of us. So I just had to chime in and throw my 2 cents in there real quick.
Well, what would you say, Michael, in response to the argument that's been made by several callers and one of the people on my Twitter feed that there has been legislation in the last decade or so, and let's grant, number one, that from the time Barack Obama was elected in 2008 until today, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House for a total of 72 days. But nonetheless, during that period of time, there's been legislation passed or Supreme Court decisions that have helped gay people, that have helped women, that have helped immigrants, that have helped Muslims, but nothing that has helped specifically African Americans.
I just don't understand what specifically. I mean, I understand like mass incarceration and overturning specific things about police reform are important, but I've heard the Democratic Party address those issues. Hell, Eric Holder filed a civil suit, a lawsuit against civil rights against the city of Ferguson, Missouri, when Mike Brown was killed. And one of the things he pointed out was it's amazing how the majority of the citizens in that city are black, yet very few of them hold public office. It's one of those things where that's a fact. The change has to come from within. It comes from participating within government. That's how government works. That's how democracy works. When I say this with all due respect, I just don't know what specifically, even me as a black man, what it is specifically the Democratic Party is supposed to do specifically for me. And I see them doing specific things like, trying to help out with mass incarceration, trying to help out with police reform. They're not stomping out in the streets every single time. You don't see members of the party or leaders of the party stomping out in the streets every single time a black person is killed by the police. But I mean, that's not. I don't know if that's something that I would expect or something that I would need for the Democratic Party to do in order to earn my vote as a black man or as an African American.
Okay, thank you. You were going somewhere with that thought, and I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, it's okay, kind of, sort of. Well, I mean, I was going somewhere with that thought, but that's not even what I initially called about. But I just wanted to chime in on that because I hear a lot of us, talking that way and saying stuff like that. And like I said, I get it, but at the same time, I just don't. I really wish we take a little bit more time to implement ourselves within the party structure before we say that the party's not doing anything for us.
I get it. Michael, well said. Thank you very much for the call. I appreciate it. James in Spokane, Washington. Hey, James, what's up?
Talking about what we want our politicians or parties to do for us. Tom, I want them to be full-throated all the time. I want them to sweat for me. I want them to cry for me. I want them to metaphorically bleed for me. If they can't get on the mainstream media, they need to be in my town square.
They are. I mean, Democratic politicians are holding town hall meetings all over the country. Republicans, zero.
Question for you, Tom. I was raised as a Catholic. I went to parochial school most of my childhood, or most of my education. I was taught that Jesus de Cristo believed that pride is a vice and humility is a virtue. What do you think, Dr. Tom?
It certainly is consistent with what I learned and what I've read in the Bible. Well, why?
Well, it seems that, again, patriotism for a nation is jingoism. If it isn't fealty for the whole human race, for the entire biosphere or the universe, it seems to me that it's hollow and insincere. It's not real.
Well, I think we can walk and chew gum. I think we need to have both. But your point is made, James, and well said. Thank you very much for the call. I appreciate it. Dean in Chicago. Hey, Dean, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Good. What's up?
I'm wondering how come the Democratic Party and the quote Democratic media isn't smart enough to paint Trump and the Republican Party with the same broad brush. Like when they almost have like there's three parties. There's the Democrats, there's Trump, and the Republicans. Yeah. And it seems like the Republicans are always getting a pass. And the truth is, the Republicans or Trump would be totally disabled or disarmed without the support of the Republicans. And the media does not marry these two.
Yeah. No, the media has many failings, and yeah, I get it, Dean, and that's one of them. And I can't account for it other than that the corporate media in America has a strong Republican bias and always has. And the Republicans of the party have big business, and the media in this country is now big business. I constantly have these. I was just looking at the chyrons, the lower third, the graphics in the lower third of CNN and MSNBC, over the last hour, and they're talking about, you know, the family separation and bringing the kids and parents together from these families, and they're still in their chyrons, they're referring to them as immigrants. These are not immigrants. These are refugees. These are people who came here legally seeking refuge under the laws of the United States and international treaties that allow people to come to this country and other countries and present themselves at the border and say, I am seeking asylum. I am a refugee. I'm fleeing violence in my home country. These are not immigrants. And we need to stop calling them immigrants and start calling them refugees. Refugees has a whole completely different meaning at law and at gut, you know, emotionally. And we need to recognize that. Dave in Buffalo, New York, listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Thanks, Tom. We need refugee welcoming centers, not immigrant detention centers.
Amen.
Thank you, Tom. But what I was calling about is restructuring policing. And we can restructure policing through literacy. And the structure of doing that can be found at policeabc.ca. And what you'll find there is a way that we can organize and reorganize our policing. And what it offers us is that we can, Canada did the idea comes from Canada, and that's what the CA is for.
Yeah.
And what happens is that Canada took a literacy test through the country, and what they determined is that low literacy, high crime. High literacy, low crime. And so what you can do with the policing through literacy at policeabc.ca is that when the police show up at an incident, they determine the perpetrator's literacy, and then they also do the victim's literacy, and they also include everybody that witnessed the crime, because they feel as if that if you're involved in that area and that situation, that everybody needs to be analyzed. And then they send you to school, and they give you better literacy, and they teach you at whatever, and the police are taught on how to determine what your literacy rate is and what program perhaps you should be enrolled in. And then it raises the country's literacy rate instead of raising the country's incarceration rate. And I believe that raising literacy through policing is a better way to go than locking everyone up, Tom.
Yeah. Well said, Dave. Very well said. That should be a slogan, right? Oh, man. There are so many challenges that we're facing, and yet there are so many people across this country of goodwill who are really committed to facing those challenges head on. We need to be supporting them politically.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And there's great organizations around the country that you can join, you can participate with whatever niche within this spectrum of stuff you're interested in, go for it. And welcome back. Let me see here. Joan in Nashville, Tennessee, watching on Free Speech TV. Hey, Joan, what's on your mind?
Well, I want to first address the young African-American man who just called and spoke to what he saw as or what he sees as the poor participation of African-Americans in the electoral process. Mm-hmm. But, and I don't, well, yeah, I have to put some responsibility on him because, it's, you know, he has the ability to read history and to find out why. I mean, African Americans, as long as we've been able to vote, we've participated. But our voting doesn't get us anything. In fact, if you have enough money, you don't have to vote at all, and your issues and concerns are addressed. So just voting isn't the answer. And
but it is a piece, is it not?
It's a piece, but it's, in my experience, it's like throwing money out the window, because African Americans' votes have put many of whites in office, and then once they get into office, they completely ignore us.
Yeah.
I mean, just like the other lady, African American, mentioned, all of the compassion, all of the empathy for what's happening on the border with the Latinos, and as a human being, that hurts me too. But it seems that nobody, just like the lady said, they cannot extend that same compassion and empathy toward the plight of African Americans. Every factor, every element that you mentioned when you're talking about the Latinos at the border or people in other countries, African Americans are experiencing those same situations and conditions every day, and they're being perpetrated by the American government with the sanction either implicitly or explicitly by white Americans. But yet they can go to war to defend people in other countries when they are abusing our human rights. It's illegal for me to be black and breathing. Now, how do you deal with that? How do you live with that every day? The question that needs to be asked is, why aren't all African Americans murderers? Why don't all African Americans shoot or kill or harm any white person they come in contact with? Because this country's been at war with us ever since we've been here. They brought us here to be at war with us. Our situation is different from everybody else's in this country, with the exception of the Native Americans. And yet they spend all this energy and time and money fighting other countries when they're doing the same thing to African Americans. In fact, people who come to this country, the people on the border now that I am empathizing with, once those people get in this country and become white, they will turn on black people just like the whites who are already here. But yet we are supposed to always be compassionate, always empathize. What about us? And we're not.
I hear you,
demanding.
Joan, I've got that music is we're hitting a break here, but I hear you. Thank you so much. We'll be back. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at thomsbeats.com, thomsbeets.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, Thom.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Edna in Cleveland, Ohio. Hey, Edna, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to comment on the African-American callers. I'm a 70-year-old African-American woman, and to say that voting doesn't help, my head wanted to explode. You have to vote. You have to vote in every election. We voted in massive numbers for Obama, and then we didn't come back in the midterm and support him, and we let the Congress go. That's the type of thing that hurts us. You have to vote, and you have to vote in every election, not just the presidential election. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you. You said it very well, Edna. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good talking with you. I appreciate it. Let's see here. Thomas in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Hey, Thomas, what's up?
Tom, how are you today,
Good.
sir?
Good. What's on your mind?
Good. Hey, I think if we quit dropping bombs a lot, and maybe do a little bit of financial help down in Central and South America, we could solve a lot of the refugee problems. And it'd probably be less expensive than throwing bombs on people. And
yeah, let's be very clear that the refugees who are showing up on our southern borders right now are fleeing violence in 3 countries that Ronald Reagan intervened in, meddled with, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador. He funded essentially revolutions, changes in governance in all 3 of those countries, and the consequence of that has been 40 years of civil war. And people are fleeing basically civil wars in each one of those 3 countries, whether declared or undeclared. This is the result of Republican U.S. foreign policy, period. Back to you.
Correct. But, I mean, if we stop meddling in other people's affairs like that, we wouldn't be having the refugees trying to come here. And when they do need to come here, especially with what you just described, how can you turn them away? Isn't that inhumane?
It is. It absolutely
is. You
is.
create the problem, and then you don't want to do nothing to solve it.
Yep, it absolutely is.
Instead of making a regime change, why don't we find out what they need as a country? You know what I mean? Do they need some technology? Do they need education?
Well, they need, I mean, you know, Costa Rica solved this problem, Thomas. At the same time that we were trashing, you know, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And thank you for the call, Thomas. At the same time, we were taking those countries apart, you know, Reagan was. Costa Rica said, enough of this. We're not even going to have an army. It's not a good expenditure of money. We're a little country, you know, we're just not even going to have an army, and we're going to have very low cost, virtually free health care for everybody and college education for all, full education, all the way up through MD for everybody. And last time Louise and I were in Costa Rica, we had a cab driver take us out to where we were going. He was talking about how his 2 kids just graduated from college, and you know, everybody has great health care and everything. It's like, it's amazing. John in McKees Rock, Pennsylvania. Hey, John. Got about a minute and a half here. What's up?
Yes, thanks for taking my call before the show ends. Tom, I don't listen to your show as often as I used to, but I don't really hear Venezuela covered or what's happening in Palestine, especially Venezuela and the hyperinflation. Yeah. Now, about your book, about the crash of 2016, you know, eventually hyperinflation is going to hit us. And I feel it's going to be, they're going to blame Trump or maybe even the Democrats if they control Congress in November. So, I mean, regardless, I don't really see, if you have everybody in power that should be, you know, I mean, just suppose we create change in this country. I think it's going to be too late by then.
Well, I think, you know, in terms of whether or not there's a major economic correction coming, it is already way too late. And the problem is that we haven't, I'm going to sneeze here. Excuse me. The problem is that we haven't fixed the damaged structures, economic structures that were basically wrecked by, you know, but largely during the Reagan administration, some of it by Republicans at the end of the Clinton administration by Congress. But, you know, the deregulation of the banks, the deregulation of the insurance industries, the change in the law about executive compensation. So now CEOs, ever since the mid-'80s, CEOs no longer care about the local community. They no longer care about their workers. They only care about the stock price because that's how they get paid. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of structural stuff there, John, that is, you know, that we need to be looking at step by step. But, and yeah, I would, in fact, there's a couple of people who are really good on Venezuela. We should get them on the show. And the Palestinian situation, obviously, is a real problem. Thanks a lot for the call. Thank you for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. And in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's really not. We can't afford to just sit back and say, you know, not a big deal. No, you've got to get involved. Get out there, get registered to vote, and act. Tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Cameron Hughes scours the world looking for the finest wines. You can get more information about Cameron Hughes and his wines at chwine.com/Tom, T-H-O-M.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beats. More information is available over at thomsbeets.com, THOMSBEETS.com, or by calling 800-568-9889. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair chair, office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairthom.com.